Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 676 Escape. On the streets of Tarosh, dozens of masked mercenaries suddenly emerged from the front and back of the street. They drew their swords and rushed towards Asha, the messenger of the Iron Throne, and one of her subordinates, an Ironborn named Mond. Kill her. The two had experienced many battles and naturally reacted well. Oops. Run. Asha and her Ironborn changed their expressions, and then without any hesitation, let alone drawing their swords to resist, they turned their horses' heads and rushed towards the direction with the least number of assassins. Get out of the way. In this era, if you don't have magic, even the most skilled knights can't fight against dozens of people at the same time, because you don't have so many eyes. And Asha and Gmond's choice was not wrong. They rode their horses and accelerated suddenly and crashed to the side. The mercenaries didn't dare to stop them with their lives. After all, being hit by a running horse would either kill or injure them. Asha rushed out on her horse, but the Ironborn under Asha were not so lucky. A masked mercenary seized the opportunity and pulled him off his horse. He fell to the ground. The horse neighed in pain and crashed into the stable of the tavern next to him. Puff, puff, puff. Then the masked mercenary drew the dagger from his waist and stabbed the unfortunate Ironborn several times in the abdomen. Blood gushed out in an instant. The face of the Ironborn named Gmund was still full of disbelief. He stared at the killer who killed him with wide eyes. This attack came very unexpectedly. No one thought that in the streets of Tarosh, in broad daylight, someone would dare to attack the messenger of the Iron Throne, a commander-in-chief with 2,000 soldiers in his hands. Hehe. Then the blood gushing out of his throat blocked his trachea. He looked at Asha's back and wanted to say something, but he didn't say it. Then his head tilted and he swallowed his last breath. Not far away, Asha Greyjoy rushed out of the ambush and turned her horse's head. She stood on the street and looked behind. She saw with her own eyes that her father, who was once loyal to her father and followed her to hide in the mountains of the Westerly, was killed by this group of masked villains. Her eyes suddenly turned red. Damn it. On the other side, the masked mercenary who stabbed Gmund to death, wiped the blood on the dagger on the other's body, raised his head, and saw Asha Greyjoy riding a horse not far away looking at this side. His eyes showed a sarcastic emotion, and then he raised his palm and made a throat-cutting gesture to Asha. This was a naked provocation. Asha's eyes were red, and her palm pinched the reins and made a sound. However, at this moment, the Iron Princess of the Iron Islands could only be helpless and furious. It was impossible for her to draw her sword and kill again. That was an act of suicide. Chase. On the other side, the masked mercenaries who had just surrounded them from front and back had gathered together. The leader who had just stabbed Gemon to death waved his hand and pointed at Asha who was not far away. Then the masked mercenaries chased after Asha. Seeing this, Asha's face changed slightly again, and then she pulled the reins to turn the horse's head and squeezed her legs hard on the horse's belly. Go. At this moment, the streets of Taroshi were in chaos, and people screamed and ran away. Murder. Murder. The scene that just happened was so sudden that many people did not react at the first time. However, now they finally came to their senses, looking at the body lying in a pool of blood on the ground and the murderer holding a sharp knife. They were in chaos in an instant, crying and shouting, and fleeing in all directions. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. The chaos on the street affected Asha's escape on her warhorse, because now that the speed had slowed down, she could not directly crash out a path, and there were frightened people running everywhere. However, this strong Iron Princess was not a weak character. She gritted her teeth and jumped off the horse, abandoning her horse and trying to escape with the help of the chaotic crowd. The chaos on the street blocked Asha's escape and naturally affected the pursuit of the masked mercenaries. Get out of here. But they were not as civilized as Asha. They saw Asha abandon her horse and blend into the crowd. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared. They were immediately a little angry. Don't let her run away. The masked mercenaries were furious when they saw Asha disappear. They drew their swords and chopped at the Taroshi civilians and slaves who blocked their way. hoping to kill their way out and find the escaping Asha. However, the result was beyond the expectations of the masked mercenary leader. Their sword drawing and killing caused greater panic, and the streets became more chaotic and the situation became confusing. Chase. Chase. Asha fled in front, and the masked mercenaries were like hounds, still chasing her, as if they would never give up, until they killed Asha. The purpose of their trip was not to kill the Ironborn, but to target the messenger of the Iron Throne. If they couldn't kill her, killing more people would be in vain. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. The enemy desperately chased her for money or greater benefits, while Asha ran away for her own life, and of course she was going all out. The woman with short black hair panted slightly, then raised her hand, and grabbed a small cart selling oysters, clams, and oysters on the roadside. Give it to me. She pushed the seafood vendor away, and pushed him to the ground, and the innocent vendor who didn't know what was happening was pushed directly to his buttocks, and fell heavily to the ground. Hey, 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 what are you doing? Crash. However, Asha ignored the vendor, and then raised her hand, and overturned the cart with a crash. The cart fell sideways, and blocked the middle of the road. The smelly seawater and shells were scattered all over the ground in an instant, to block the enemy's pursuit. The woman with short black hair was running in front, and the killer was chasing her closely behind. Then Asha turned into a small alley flexibly, hoping to get rid of them with the help of the complex terrain. However, at this moment, an inconspicuous door in the alley suddenly opened unexpectedly. There was a tall man in the room. Because the room was dark and there was no light, his face could not be seen clearly. He raised his hand to grab Asha. His movements were fast, accurate, and ruthless, and Asha couldn't react in time. Come in. He grabbed the black-haired woman's wrist directly, then pulled her into the room, and then slammed the door. Chapter 677 Helping Hands. Asha was caught off guard and dragged into the house by a man. She was naturally shocked. Moreover, the man was very skilled, and she didn't even react. However, the house in the alley was dark because there was no light. There was only a faint light from the other side, but it was still a little dim, and she couldn't see the other person's face clearly. Then she clenched one hand and asked sharply, "Who are you?" "You." "Quiet." However, the man standing opposite him had let go of Asha at this moment. His voice was low and powerful, and he interrupted Asha's words directly. But it really made the Iron Princess, who had always been unruly, shut up instantly, and her face was full of doubt. Because the other person's voice made her feel very familiar, but she hadn't heard it for many years. The other person's fingers were very strong. He just grabbed Asha's wrist and dragged her into the house. Now that he let go of his hand, the woman's wrist was still slightly red and painful. She seemed to have thought of who the owner of the voice was. She couldn't see the other person's face clearly, but she had a vague guess in her heart. However, this guess was too bold, so that even Asha couldn't believe it. But Asha thought of what the other person had just said, and thought of the fierce pursuers before, and then she stopped talking, and obediently shut her mouth. However, at this moment, there was a noisy and chaotic sound from the alley outside the door of the house. It was obvious that the pursuers who had just chased Asha had caught up. "Where is this bitch?" The group of masked criminals who were chasing Asha were obviously very familiar with the terrain of Tarosh. Therefore, when they were chasing her just now, one group of people chased her relentlessly, while the other group took the opportunity to go around to the other side, preparing to use the same trick to encircle the other party again. And if the encirclement was successful this time, Asha would not be able to escape, even if she was possessed by Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Dawn. However, now the group of masked pursuers panted and chased after her, as if they had seen a ghost, because Asha disappeared in their encirclement. What's going on? Where are the people? The leader of the masked mercenaries was furious and angrily asked the pursuers who met on the other side. How should I know? However, the mercenaries on the other side were also very innocent, because they didn't see anyone, and they just chased all the way here. Did this bitch fly away with wings? The mercenary leader said, while suppressing his anger, but everyone knew that it was impossible to fly away with wings, so he cast his suspicious eyes on the doors of the houses in this alley. Someone helped her escape. Quick, search. Wait a little longer, the city guard will be here. They bribed a captain of the city guard in advance for this operation. The Tirashes are known for their greed, and even the election of the Grand Lord is full of bribes. As long as you can afford the price, even the position of the Grand Lord can be sold to you. Of course, the premise of this matter is that you can afford the price. Therefore, they bribed the city guard, which led to such a serious and vicious case, and the reason why the guard still did not arrive. However, there must be a limit to this matter. The greater the price they pay, the longer the time they will buy. They originally thought that it would not take a long time to kill and escape, but they did not expect Asher and the Ironborn to react quickly. This woman actually broke out of the encirclement and caused trouble for them, so that now they are in a situation where they are riding a tiger and can't get off. They have to chase her, even if they can't catch her, otherwise this mission will definitely fail, and the price of failure is something they can't afford. The masked mercenary could see his livid face through the black cloth, and the other mercenaries naturally knew the price of failure. Everyone began to search desperately for the whereabouts of Asher Greyjoy. Open the door. Open the door. Bang bang bang, they kicked open the doors of every house to search, and Asher, who was hiding in one of the small rooms, became nervous again. Hey, what should we do? However, the man opposite did not speak, but silently grasped a huge axe hidden behind the door. But at this moment, the sound of shouting and killing suddenly came from outside the door. It turned out that the guards of Tirosh finally arrived late. The news that the Iron Throne messenger was attacked and then escaped reached the palace of the Grand Lord of Tirosh, who was horrified upon hearing the news. Then he hurriedly ordered to protect the messenger and not let the messenger get into trouble in Tirosh, so the guards of Tirosh rushed out to capture the criminals. The captain who led the group was the one who bribed the group. At this moment, he was wearing armor that was about to burst with a round belly, and he spoke loudly with righteousness. Lawless. Catch them. Then the defenders of Tirosh rushed forward to capture the masked mercenaries. However, these masked mercenaries were naturally not easy to deal with. They all had licked blood on the blade and had rich combat experience. Naturally, they fought back, and the two sides fought in the alley. Even this group of mercenaries briefly gained the upper hand, killing the defenders of Tirosh and making them throw away their armor and retreat step by step. However, although most of the defenders of Tirosh were useless, just like the gold cloaks in the past, they were numerous, and Tirosh also had a famous mercenary corps. Then the masked mercenaries died or were injured. The masked mercenary leader saw the wrong opportunity and fought his way out of the blood and escaped, while the rest were captured alive or killed and were soon suppressed. The Iron Throne messenger Asher Greyjoy, who was hiding in the dark room, and the middle-aged man holding the giant axe, all breathed a sigh of relief. No matter what secrets were behind this matter, the Tirosh Lord would not dare to kill the messenger of the Iron Throne in broad daylight, no matter how brave he was. Otherwise, an inevitable war would come in an instant. Tirosh is the closest city-state to the Westeros continent, and the Iron Throne does not even need to set out from Westeros to send troops to Tirosh. The legion stationed in Pentis is enough to flatten this island city-state. Therefore, when the Tirosh defenders appeared, they were considered safe. Then the tall and burly middle-aged man put down the giant axe in his hand, found a flint and lit the candle in the room. The swaying flames dispelled the darkness in the room. Asher Greyjoy also saw the man's face clearly. It was a face that was very familiar to her. Her bold guess just now turned out to be true, and she couldn't help but blurt out the words that were on her lips. Uncle. The alarm didn't ring. I slept too much. Chapter 678, Victarion. The man who stood in front of Asher and saved her from danger was her third uncle Victarion. Compared to the past, his dark hair had a lot more grey. It seemed that he had not had a good time in recent years and had gone through countless ups and downs. However, the captain of the Iron Victory, who was once the commander-in-chief of the Iron Fleet, still had a sturdy figure and strong arms. There were many more crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. He looked at his eldest niece and sighed deeply. Asher. However, for Asher, the fact that her uncle Victarion was still alive was definitely the biggest surprise. Because Victarion was the most loyal follower of her father Balon, Victarion had never disobeyed his brother's orders. He respected and even worshipped his eldest brother. When they were young, Victarion was also very good to Asher and Little Fionn, including their brothers Roderick and Meryn, and often took them to play and go to sea. But unfortunately, the two brothers of the siblings, Roderick and Marin, died when the Iron Throne army invaded Pike City. At that time, Victorian held Asher, who was crying, and said goodbye to his little brother Theon. Because he was sent to Winterfell as an adopted son and hostage, Theon was too young to remember much at that time. In fact, Asher shed a lot of tears with her back to him. However, when the White Walkers began to invade, Balon Greyjoy originally believed that the White Walkers could not cross the sea, and decided to sit on the sidelines and watch the excitement in the Greenland. But he did not expect that the White Walkers would sneak attack the Black Tide Island by boat. He did not believe it at that time, and sent his third brother Victorian to lead an Iron Fleet to explore the Black Tide Island. Since then, Victorian and the Iron Fleet he led, and the invincible Iron Victory disappeared in the sea together, disappearing without a trace. Asher thought that her third uncle had died long ago, or became a member of the army of the dead like her father Balon. But she did not expect that Victorian would appear in Tirosh, and it seemed that he was still alive and well. "Uncle, how could you?" Asher was surprised and happy. A relative who was thought to be dead was resurrected. Then she couldn't help but grab Victorian's shoulders and asked. Then the uncle and nephew hugged briefly, and Asher let go of each other and asked again. Still repeating the previous question, she wanted to know what had happened to Victorian in these years. However, the burly former commander-in-chief of the Iron Fleet shook his head, sighed, and then spoke. Long story short, Victorian briefly recounted what happened after he escaped from Black Tide Island because he had experienced too much. At that time, the Black Tie family on Black Tide Island sent a letter for help claiming that they were attacked. He obeyed his brother's order and led an Iron Fleet to explore the situation on Black Tide Island. However, the Iron Fleet led by Victorian was ambushed by the White Walkers after landing on Black Tide Island. The White Walkers seemed to have intelligence. They were very cunning and set up a siege to annihilate all the Ironborn led by Victorian. Their ships were also attacked by the White Walkers, and most of the warships were buried in the cold sea water. Victorian fought and ran until the last moment, but was attacked by a White Walker. He was very impressed by that White Walker, because it was a female White Walker with grey hair. She held an ice bow and arrow, and shot him in the shoulder with an arrow, almost killing him. Victorian was finally forced to jump into the sea to survive. He thought he was dead and was going to the drowned god's palace of water, but he didn't expect that when he woke up again, he had been rescued and was lying on a merchant ship. This merchant ship was under the flag of the Tirosh Merchant Company, and they were fleeing to their hometown. Victorian originally wanted to ask to get off the ship. He wanted to go back to the Iron Islands to tell his brother about the White Walker attack. However, the captain of the merchant ship told Victorian that they did not save him without a price. He had to repay the value of his life. He is now a slave. At this point, Victorian lifted his messy long hair and pointed to the scar clearly exposed on his side face. This was the mark left on him by the slave owner. People with such a mark in Tirosh are obviously slaves. In fact, the reason why the Tirosh merchant ship did not choose to throw him back into the sea after saving him was because of Victorian's strong body. Such a capable slave can be sold at a good price, especially for customers in Slavers Bay, Meereen, Junfei, etc. They have the top gladiatorial arena culture there, and a capable slave can even be sold for hundreds of gold marks or gold coins. The gold mark is the legal currency of Junfei, the city-state of Slavers Bay. On one side is a pyramid, and on the other side is the harpy of the ancient kingdom of Gis, and the gold coin is the currency of Meereen. Moreover, the captain of the Tirosh merchant fleet also told Victorian that the Iron Islands had been destroyed by the attacks of the White Walkers, and the Greyjoy family had completely disappeared. It was for this reason that they were preparing to evacuate Westeros with all their supplies. The owner of the Tirosh merchant fleet judged that even with the help of the young dragon lord and his dragons and the Dothraki who crossed the poisonous water, the continent of Westeros would still fall completely in the future and eventually become a forbidden zone for life. Victorian was struck by lightning when he heard the captain's words. He didn't know that so many things had happened while he was unconscious. His hometown had fallen and his family had been destroyed. In fact, the captain didn't know Victorian. He just thought he was a strong iron warrior, so there was no need to deceive him. Therefore, Victorian suffered a major blow, was discouraged, and he had no right to ask the fleet to stop moving forward. In the end, he followed the fleet to Tirosh like a resigned person. And what happened next is a long story. He actually went to Myrene and was sold to a slave trader. In the end, after going through untold hardships and fighting hard, he won the championship of Myrene and earned a lot of gold coins for his master. Later, he won the championship and his status in his master's heart rose. He got a lot of freedom, so Victorian found the right opportunity to successfully escape the control of the slave trader. He killed the other party with a knife and became a wanted criminal, so he boarded a merchant ship and returned to Tirosh. Now he has just returned to Tirosh after traveling half the world. He plans to settle down here and be an ordinary mercenary quietly. Then he heard that a fleet of the Iron Throne visited Tirosh, and the commander-in-chief of the fleet was his niece Asha. Chapter 679 Control of the Port. The messenger of the Iron Throne was assassinated by a group of desperate criminals on the streets of Tirosh. The messenger's entourage died on the street, and the messenger himself escaped after experiencing great danger. This was naturally a major event that was enough to cause a great earthquake. The Lord of Tirosh was furious and demanded a thorough investigation of the truth of the matter. Asha, who escaped by chance, was even more angry because she almost died in the city of Tirosh, and the subordinates who were once loyal to her father also died tragically on the street. If it weren't for her uncle Victorian who happened to save her in Tirosh, Asha would have really died. Therefore, when the hot-tempered Iron Princess returned to the fleet, she immediately ordered the entire fleet of the Targaryen family to go out and directly control the port of Tirosh at lightning speed. She strictly prohibited anyone from entering or leaving the port, and asked the Lord of Tirosh to explain the matter and arrest all the murderers. The naval soldiers of the Targaryen family suddenly launched an attack and easily controlled the port of Tirosh. The morale of the Tirosh defenders was not high. Facing the fierce attack, they easily laid down their weapons and knelt down to surrender. A large number of them knelt down densely. The flag on the top of the Tirosh port was also lowered, and now it was flying the three-headed dragon flag symbolizing the Iron Throne. However, not long after the Targaryen soldiers took control of the port, Tirosh's most elite mercenary corps arrived. The atmosphere of the entire port city-state instantly became tense. The two sides confronted each other, and the war seemed to be imminent. The people living in the port area of the city were also panicked. They closed the doors and windows of their homes, and dared not go out on the streets for fear of being implicated. The Tirosh Lord was also in a state of panic at this moment. The envoy of the Iron Throne was attacked when he went to Tirosh, and almost died on the street. Naturally, he could not escape the blame. Although anyone with a discerning eye can see at a glance that there must be something fishy behind this incident, and it is suspected that someone has framed and provoked the relationship between Tirosh and the Iron Throne. But in the final analysis, this incident happened in Tirosh territory. If the Iron Throne messenger really died in Tirosh, unless the Lord of Tirosh can find decisive evidence, he will really jump into the Yellow River and cannot clear himself. Therefore, the Lord of Tirosh ordered that on the one hand, the matter should be thoroughly investigated, and on the other hand, the Lord of Tirosh should actively ease the emotions of the Iron Throne messenger and ask him to lift the control of the port of Tirosh. However, the Lord of Tirosh's request was strongly rejected by Asha Greyjoy, who asked the Lord of Tirosh to give her an explanation before she could lift the blockade of the port. The confrontation between the two sides lasted from day to night, and the fleet soldiers of the Targaryen family still occupied the port of Tirosh and did not let anyone in or out. There were a large number of merchant ships waiting to enter the city on the sea, and there were also a large number of caravan goods in the city waiting to be sent to merchant ships and shipped to all parts of the world. But even so, the Tiroshi people still did not dare to attack the Targaryen family's fleet, and could only choose to continue to swallow their anger, otherwise a war would really break out. However, at this juncture, an accident suddenly occurred in the interrogation in the Tiroshi prison on the other side. The Tiroshi guards captured several captives in the daytime attack. The Grand Lord demanded to pry open these people's mouths at all costs, so they were ready to pull out all their nails one by one and make them open their mouths and tell the truth. But at this time, the group of captives suddenly tightened their throat muscles violently, their faces turned a terrifying purple, and then blood gushed out of their 7 orifices and died. All the captives were poisoned to death, and the clues were completely interrupted. The Grand Lord of Tiroshi did not sleep that night. He was furious again when he heard the news. He was really a little restless this time, because he felt that this was a long planned frame up, which was to provoke the relationship between the Iron Throne and Tiroshi. The messenger of the Iron Throne was attacked on the streets of Tirosh, and the guards were late in arriving, which made it difficult for him to defend himself. Now the captured prisoners were all poisoned to death in the prison of Tirosh. Even the Lord of Tirosh himself even doubted whether he was playing a trick of killing to silence the witnesses, and whether he had issued such an order while sleepwalking. However, the Lord of Tirosh was very sober, and he definitely did not make such a decision. What benefit would it bring to him if the messenger of the Iron Throne died in Tirosh? Then before dawn, the Lord of Tirosh stayed awake all night with a pair of red eyes, and the guards of Tirosh also went out to capture the masked mercenaries who escaped during the day, but they had little effect. After all, the other party was masked at the time, and Tirosh, as a trading city-state, had a mixed population with all kinds of people, and there was no way to screen them. However, the overpass pursuit did have some effect, and they caught the prisoner who poisoned all the prisoners in the prison. He was a jailer in Tiroshi prison. He received a large bribe in the evening of that day. The glittering gold coins were enough to blind his eyes. All he had to do was put some tiny purple particles like seeds into the prisoner's drinking water. The person promised him that no one would be able to track him down. Money can attract people. Therefore, the greedy jailer agreed to the other party's conditions, put these tiny particles into the water, and then poisoned all the prisoners captured during the day. However, just when he thought that no one would track him down, the guards of Tiroshi came to the door. The interrogation that followed was extremely cruel. The Tiroshi prince demanded to find out the truth at all costs, so it was the turn of the jailer to bear the pain for the prisoners during the day. The guards pulled out the jailer's nails one by one and made him spit out all the truth, including who bribed him, what he looked like, what the particles were, etc. The jailer was of low moral character, so he naturally didn't keep his mouth shut. When he pulled out his first nail, he spilled everything he knew. But in the end, the guards of Tirosh pulled out all his nails, leaving him to die in agony. The jailer claimed that the man who offered him a bribe was not tall, had an accent from another place, and was suspected to be from Volantis. There were also flames on his cheeks. As for the poison the man gave him, he didn't know what it was. Chapter 680 The Mill Incident. Strangler. This is obviously the effect of the strangler. After a night of turmoil in the prison of Tiroshi, they still found some clues. A gray-haired old man trembled and spoke while holding a cane. Although the free trade city did not have a bachelor, it had a doctor. This gray-haired old man was the leading doctor in Tiroshi and was very knowledgeable about poisons. He was invited by the Tiroshi Grand Lord to identify the poison from which all the captives died of poisoning. When the old man came here, he recognized at a glance that these people died of a very terrible strong poison, the strangler. Because the effect of killing people with a strangler is very obvious, the victim's face will appear the same purple color as the poison, as if they were strangled to death or choked to death by pinching the neck, so it was named strangler. But the obvious difference between the strangler and death caused by trauma is that bleeding from all 7 orifices and the amount of bleeding caused by poison is greater, and the death is more miserable and terrifying. The strangler is expensive to make. It is made from a plant that only grows in the Jade Sea Islands half a world away. Its leaves need to be left for a long time, then soaked in lime water, sugar juice, and some precious spices from the Summer Islands. The leaves are then discarded, and ashes are added to the potion to make it thick, and then left to crystallize. The process is slow and difficult, and the ingredients required are expensive, so the price of the strangler is not cheap. But there are many people in this world who can make the strangler. As far as I know, they include the alchemists of lies, the faceless men of Bravus, and the citadel in your Westeros. The white-haired old man spoke in a trembling voice. He finished all his words, then bowed and retreated. At this moment, the underground prison in Tirosh was brightly lit, and the guards held torches high and guarded various places in the prison. Because of a series of recent events, the high-ranking officials in Tirosh have become highly nervous. Everyone is worried about their own safety and has increased the security forces around them, fearing that a group of people will suddenly rush out to assassinate them, just like what happened to Asher. The torches in the underground world swayed slightly in the wind, illuminating people's cheeks. Now the Lord of Tirosh and the Messenger of the Iron Throne, Asher Greyjoy, are all gathered in the prison, discussing the whole thing face to face and calmly. After a night, Asher's anger has subsided. After some careful consideration and analysis with her uncle, she probably ruled out the suspicion of the Lord of Tirosh. Unless he is crazy, he will kill the Messenger of the Iron Throne in his own territory. Such a naked provocation will inevitably lead to a war. Of course, another extreme possibility is not ruled out, using the inertia of human thinking to do the opposite. The Lord of Tiroshi secretly instructed his subordinates to kill him, pretending to be framed, and then framed others, and then caused a conflict between the Iron Throne and the other party. It was a strategy of driving the tiger to eat the wolf. However, in response to the invitation of the Lord of Tiroshi, Asher still came, but this time she was accompanied by more than one guard, but more than 100 soldiers. You have heard it, my Lord Envoy. These criminals died of strangulation. The Lord of Tiroshi listened to the words of the old man who was proficient in medicine and poisons, then turned his head with a round belly, and looked at Asher and said, when they first met, the Lord of Tiroshi was still a little impolite, but in just one day, his attitude changed 180 degrees. Because of Asher Greyjoy's tough attitude, she brazenly ordered the capture of the port of Tiroshi, and asked him to explain, which also shocked the Lord of Tiroshi, making him put down his discrimination against women and couldn't help but look at him with a higher opinion. This was reflected in his verbal expressions of respect, and his attitude was much lower. After all, the other party was a woman who would draw a knife if she disagreed with him. This matter was full of doubts from the beginning. It is obvious that someone intended to frame and sow discord between Tirosh and the Great Emperor. When Vizira's name was mentioned, the Tirosh Lord lowered his attitude even more and was even a little humble with respect in his words. As for the mastermind behind this matter, based on the information we have learned so far, I guess it should be Lies and Volantis. Lies alchemists are well known, and they are best at making terrible poisons. And because of well-known reasons, Lies also has sufficient reasons to provoke the relationship between the Iron Throne and Tirosh, because on the issue of the disputed land, both sides hope to win the support of His Majesty the Emperor's invincible army. If you, the envoy, die in Tirosh, the relationship between the Iron Throne and Tirosh will inevitably crack, and even lead to war, and Lies will benefit from it. There is naturally nothing wrong with analyzing from the perspective of the beneficiary. The Lord of Tirosh is not hereditary, but has ascended to this position through a series of elections, just like the seeking of Bravus, so the Lord of Tirosh is naturally not a waste. He talked freely in front of Asher with his belly full, and took the opportunity to divert the blame to the other two opponents. Needless to say, Lies, the sisters of the three sister kingdoms are now enemies, especially after Miss Decline. It has become a tit-for-tat between Tirosh and Lies. As the overlord of the southwest region of Essos, Volantis has a very powerful army. It is also an invader who once invaded Tirosh. Now it still covets more land ambitiously, and is naturally Tirosh's #1 enemy. Now every time Volantis shows interest in the disputed land, it will even make Lies and Tirosh temporarily put down their wars and unite against the outside world. As for Volantis, it is also very suspicious. Because according to the confession of the jailer we captured, he claimed that a man with a flame scar on his face, and speaking with a Volantis accent gave him the poison, and asked him to poison everyone and kill them. The words of the Tirosh Lord made the Iron Race present, including Asher, look suspicious. Now that these evidences are in front of us, coupled with the solemn assurance of the Lord of Tirosh, it is hard not to believe that this is a frame-up, because if there is a conflict between the Iron Throne and Tirosh, Lies and Volantis will be the direct beneficiaries. However, it is still unclear who has attacked the envoy of the Iron Throne, and they have no direct evidence. But when Asher returned to the port, she still ordered the lifting of the blockade of the port of Tirosh. However, at this time, an explosive news from Me spread quickly throughout the streets and alleys of Tirosh. The Me pirate governor used the excuse of holding a meeting, but led his men to attack the other two governors in the street and kill them on the spot. Now the pirates under his command have completely controlled the entire army that was newly built from the ruins. Coincidentally, this happened at the time when Asher ordered the blockade of the port of Tarosh. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 681 Dire Wolf. The fleet of the Iron Throne went to the east, stirring up a turmoil in the world of free trade cities. Power, chaos, conspiracy, impending storm, and undercurrents. On the other side, the world away from humans is free of these disputes and conspiracies. Here is naked cold, and it is also the most primitive boundary between life and death. In such a hell on earth, power is the most ridiculous game, and only the war between the living and the dead is eternal. Whoosh, the cold wind howled, rolling up the snow, taking away all the life here, except for some cold-resistant pines and cypresses and animals. Russell, a snow-white ice wolf, was a little skinny, and it seemed that it had been hungry for a long time. Its eyes were scarlet, and it trampled a path in the snow. Then it finally climbed onto a boulder and raised its head to the sky and let out a long wolf howl. Woo! This albino ice wolf let out a mournful cry and also called out for its few companions. Dire wolves, like other wolves, are social animals that travel in groups. However, it has been a long time since it found another dire wolf. The vast ice fields north of the Great Wall were originally their territory. Even the free people did not dare to go too deep into the ice fields, otherwise they would easily get lost, freeze to death, starve, or become prey to the dire wolves. But at this moment, a subtle sound suddenly came from the violent snowstorm. Shasha. The sound was not hurried, but it quickly alerted the dire wolf. It stood on the boulder, raised its head high, the biting cold wind blew its snow-white hair, and its pair of scarlet eyes were tightly locked in the direction of the sound source, and it couldn't help but make a gurgling sound in its throat. It hoped that its howl would attract the attention of its companions, but it was also worried that the howl would attract the terrible monsters. With its shallow intelligence, the dire wolf could not understand what the White Walkers and the Whites were, but it could smell the smell. Humans or other animals that exuded this stench would go crazy, and even the top hunters on the ice field would be afraid. Russell, however, the slow sound was getting closer and closer. The albino dire wolf whimpered softly and lowered its head. It had sensed a sense of danger, but was still unwilling to leave and did not want to give up the last hope. Then, to its disappointment, the figure that emerged from the snow was a half-rotten skeleton horse. Half of its body had exposed bones, and a little yellow and black fur could be vaguely seen under the snow. On the back of the skeleton horse sat a knight in black. His clothes were a little tattered, and it seemed that he had experienced a fierce battle. A long sword hung around his waist. His face was cold and livid, without any sign of life, and his eyes were as blue as ice. He passed through the snow and found the white dire wolf standing on a high boulder, then sat on the horse's back and turned his head slightly to look at the other party. The white dire wolf was instantly as if it was facing a great enemy. Its shriveled body was tense, its hair was all blown up, and it let out a dangerous growl from its throat. Woo. Based on its experience of wandering alone in the past few years, this kind of human or other animal with blue eyes and a pungent stench is not easy to deal with. Once they find any flesh and blood and life, they will pounce on them like crazy, scaring the top predator on the ice field to flee in embarrassment. However, the white dire wolf was as if it was facing a great enemy and let out a dangerous growl from its throat, but then it seemed to have discovered something, and the warning sound in its throat disappeared. It straightened its body, tilted its head slightly, and a pair of scarlet eyes clearly showed a puzzled expression. On the other side, the Black Knight riding the skeleton horse did not pounce on the flesh and blood like other corpse ghosts. It just reined in the skeleton horse under its crotch, stood not far away and quietly looked at the white dire wolf standing on the boulder, neither moving forward nor retreating. Woo. The man and the wolf stared at each other for a long time. Then the white dire wolf once again raised its head to the sky and growled, and then took the initiative to walk towards the Black Knight. Hula, the Black Knight sitting on the horse's back had a pair of ice blue eyes flashing slightly, and then patted the back of the skeleton horse, turned over and jumped off the horse. Woo, the white dire wolf jumped down from the high boulder and let out a low growl in its throat, but there was no warning or danger in the sound, but it was more friendly. It circled around the Black Knight for a few times, and even raised its head to sniff him, as if it was identifying a certain smell on him. The Black Knight stood there and watched the white dire wolf circling around him. He was also not afraid. He raised his hand and wanted to touch the head of this big dog, but the dire wolf dodged it nimbly. Although the smell of the other party made it feel a little familiar, it didn't like people or other companions touching its head. Come with me. Seeing that the white dire wolf dodged his palm, the Black Knight was not discouraged. He squatted down and looked into the eyes of the dire wolf and then spoke in a hoarse voice. He couldn't remember how long he hadn't spoken. This voice was like the harsh sound of blades grinding against each other, which was completely different from his previous voice. However, he had no one to talk to. In this world full of white, he was even about to forget how to speak and about to forget his identity. He completely integrated into this world and became a member of it. But the Black Knight's inner persistence and repeated emphasis prevented him from sinking and sticking to his original intention. However, the whispering voice in his ear did not disappear and would reappear and add fuel to the fire every time he wavered. Come with me. You will die if you stay here. When the Black Knight spoke for the first time, there was still some doubt in the eyes of the dire wolf, wondering what the other party was saying. However, when the Black Knight spoke for the second time, his ice blue eyes were sincere, and he even stretched out a hand. The doubt in the eyes of the white dire wolf disappeared, as if it really understood what he was saying. However, it did not answer, but just sniffed the hand that the Black Knight stretched out again. Then the white dire wolf turned around and walked away without looking back. Soon it disappeared in the wind and snow. Chapter 682, The Corpse Demon Benjen. The white dire wolf left without looking back. The Black Knight, who was half kneeling in place, watched its figure disappear in the wind and snow and felt a little heavy in his heart, and then he slowly stood up. This Black Knight was Benjen Stark, who had been out of seclusion not long ago. He left the wall alone to track the traces of the White Walkers, hoping to find his sister Lyanna Stark. However, the danger outside the wall was worse than before, and the battle-hardened Chief Ranger of the Night's Watch encountered danger in less than a day. He encountered a snowstorm and wanted to find a place to spend the night and set off again the next day. However, when he came to the White Tree Village, the nearest worldling village to the wall, he was suddenly attacked by whites. There were many whites, and Benjen was only one person. In the end, he was outnumbered. Benjen killed all the whites, but fell in front of the huge fish beam wood in the White Tree Village and fainted. After that, I don't know how long it took. When Benjen opened his eyes again, there was no trace of the whites he had killed around him, and only he was still lying alone under the fish beam wood. Benjen thought he had escaped by luck, but it wasn't long before he discovered a fatal problem. Benjen suddenly realized that he seemed to no longer feel the cold. Then he realized that his body had lost all its temperature and became bone-chillingly cold, and his skin had turned livid, unlike a human being, losing all its blood color. For the first time, the Chief Ranger of the Night's Watch felt an unprecedented panic, and then he found a clean ice surface, wiped off the snow on it and looked down. Benjen saw a familiar face that belonged to him, and a pair of ice blue eyes. Was he really dead and turned into a white? The Black Knight sat under the fish beam wood in the White Tree Village and spent most of the day to figure this out. And after a fierce psychological struggle, he was finally able to accept this fact. Instead of drawing his sword and committing suicide while he was awake, he sat under the fish beam tree for most of the day, but he didn't feel any cold. If he had been in such a harsh environment outside the wall when he was a human, he might have been frozen to death if he hadn't moved for a long time. But now Banayan was calm and didn't feel any discomfort. And he didn't know how long he hadn't eaten or drunk water, but he didn't feel anything either. Banayan finally found out the benefits of being a white. He could move freely outside the wall without being affected by the worst climatic conditions here. He no longer had to endure the biting cold, and no longer had to spend a lot of effort to find food. The only price he paid was his life. From then on, he could no longer call himself a living person. Although his position in camp had not changed, even though he became a dead man, he was still willing to fight for the living. However, Benign was meticulous and had a complex and mixed feeling in his heart. He still found an important loophole. That is why he was still able to stay awake after so long. Under the command of the White Walkers, the army of the dead fearlessly charged at the human coalition. This scene left a deep psychological impression on Benjamin. The other dead were just servants of the White Walkers. They should not have their own thoughts. Otherwise, Benjamin believed that most of the dead were dead, but still willing to fight for the living. However, Benjamin still did not feel any difference from when he was alive. He remembered his name and his mission. He could still run and jump and had his own thoughts. Was he a special case? The chief ranger of the Night's Watch could not help thinking so. However, there was another possibility that Benjamin himself did not know, that he had actually forgotten most of the things. He now felt that being able to control his body was just an illusion of being controlled. However, perhaps because he had been frozen for too long, Benjamin's mind was not that active. Then he thought carefully for a long time and decided not to return to the wall to meet his brother. He was afraid that Ed would get excited and chop him with a sword. Instead, he continued his mission, heading north, using the advantages of his current identity to track the traces of the White Walkers and find his sister Lyanna Stark. He did what he said. Benjamin himself was also a vigorous and resolute character. He did enough ideological work and thought clearly about what he should do. Then he stood up and continued to move forward step by step towards the north with his sword. However, not long after, Benjamin was lucky to find his lost warhorse. This yellow and black warhorse was an old friend of Benjamin. One man and one horse had fought side by side many times outside the wall. But now this warhorse has become a skeleton horse when Benjamin fainted, but fortunately it seems to still remember its owner. At first, the skeleton horse was still resisting, opening a big mouth with rotten and exposed gums to gnaw on Benjamin's head. However, when Benjamin grabbed its reins and touched its mane, the skeleton horse stopped struggling and let Benjamin ride on its back again. Then, one man, one horse, and one sword once again moved alone toward the north in the white snow. After many days and nights, Benjamin had passed through the fist of the first men and came to the location of the Wind Sound Gorge and then met this equally lonely dire wolf. Benjamin originally wanted to travel with it, but the proud Wolf King refused him. Although its tribe was extinct, it did not need a human partner. It can continue to wander in this vast ice field, and it can also face death head-on. After the dire wolf went away, Benjamin climbed back on his warhorse, and then one man and one horse continued to go north. However, less than half a day had passed, and he encountered an unexpected situation again. But this time, Benjamin's heart was no longer calm, but gradually became hot. Because he met a White Walker. The other party rode a skeleton horse like him, but the horse's reins were a string of frosted iron chains, which made a constant sound of metal friction when walking, which was particularly eye-catching in this snowy night. Benjamin spotted the White Walker, reined in the skeleton horse under his crotch, and looked at the other party, and the white-haired White Walker obviously also spotted him. But his cold eyes just glanced at him coldly, without finding any clues. The skeleton horse under his crotch did not stop at all, but continued to move forward slowly, and then disappeared in the wind and snow. Chapter 683, Land of Eternal Winter. The white snow covered the earth. The sun above his head had disappeared for an unknown period of time. The further north he went, the more Benjamin felt that it was difficult to move forward. If I were not a white now, I would have frozen to death. Benjamin rode on a skeleton horse and followed the white-haired White Walker not far away, thinking silently in his heart. He had been following this White Walker for an unknown period of time, 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days. He had forgotten that perhaps his mind had become much duller after becoming a white, or perhaps it was the monotonous world full of white that made people stupid. Fortunately, he still had a belief in his heart and a goal in front of him. Thinking of this, Benjamin Stark slightly boosted his spirit, and then continued to openly follow behind this White Walker. In fact, when he first encountered this White Walker, Benjamin was still very nervous. After all, the other party was a legendary monster, and his thinking at that time was still that of a human. However, when the White Walker turned his head and looked at Benjen, but ignored him, Benjen's thinking changed. He was completely aware of the change in his identity. He was now a dead man. The White Walker did not regard him as a human being because there was no life in his body, and the other party did not expose his trick. After Benjen came to his senses, he realized something and hurriedly urged the skeleton horse under his crotch to follow. If he wanted to find his sister Lyanna Stark, he couldn't be like a headless fly and wander around in the huge ice field. He must have a clear goal, and the White Walker in front of him is a target he wants to follow. As long as he follows behind him, he will meet his sister and even the Night King one day. Thinking of this, Benjen's mind flashed the tall figure in the wind and snow outside Winterfell that year. He felt a little depressed, and then he couldn't help but touch the bulging place on his waist. Since he came to the wall alone, Benjen was well prepared. He carried an obsidian dagger, hidden at his waist. Although he had not tried it himself, it was said that it could kill the White Walkers. If possible, Benjen would not mind sacrificing himself to become a hero. Of course, the premise is to find his sister Lyanna, and to be able to get close to the Night King without revealing himself. The Eye of the Ice Dragon. Then, after an unknown amount of time, the sky gradually darkened, and the biting wind and snow also stopped for a while. Only then was Benjen able to look up and see the sky above his head. The sky here was extremely clear, and a winding ice dragon hung in the sky with its fangs and claws bared. Its eyes were an ice blue planet, pointing directly to the north, and the ice dragon's tail across the sky was to the south. People in the north and even outside the wall have this habit. When they go out at night, they look up at the sky and use the eyes and tail of the ice dragon to identify their direction. Then the Black Knight on horseback turned his head and looked forward. The sky there was not dark, and even faintly flickered with brilliant colors, as if the five-colored stone had fallen into the mortal world, full of mystery and unknown. It's so beautiful. He knew that he was heading north, but at this moment the map in his arms could no longer describe the place he was heading to. This place was a large unknown blank on the map, compiled by generations of Night's Watch. Because no one has ever traveled here from ancient times to the present. Most of them have died on the road, or turned back halfway. He is the first person in the history of the Night's Watch in thousands of years. There is only one descriptive name here. It is called the Land of Eternal Winter, a forbidden zone for life. Benjen followed the White Walkers into the Land of Eternal Winter, where the extreme cold is a forbidden zone for life, and based on this, in the extremely far south, he rebuilt the core capital of the Valyrian Empire, King's Landing. It is warm and peaceful here, prosperous and lively, and it is hard to imagine that it is the same continent and the same world as Benjen. The resolution to rebuild Valyria was spread through ravens and messengers. Now, Westeros and even Pentos and Andalus have recognized this country name, and gradually drafted it in the name of the Valyrian Empire in the municipal documents. The Valyrian Empire was rebuilt, and it was changed from the former free fortress system to the imperial system. The huge empire naturally needs a capital. This problem was not obvious when Viserys sat firmly on the Iron Throne and ruled the Seven Kingdoms. However, after the reform to the empire, this problem emerged and became an urgent problem to be solved. After several rounds of important resolutions, the ministers from Westeros and Viserys' royal council finally had a numerical advantage, and both sides argued for reason. The final result still existed in the two capitals of the imperial capital and the sub-capital. The political core of the Valyrian Empire was King's Landing, and Pentos, as the economic center, became the sub-capital. It's just that the administrative level of the sub-capital is half a level lower than the political core, but it still overrides other towns and administrative blocks. King's Landing is greater than Pentos, greater than the North, the Riverlands, the Stormlands, etc. Equals Old Town, Gulltown, Linersport, etc. Of course, all this happened before Viserys left King's Landing, but at that time the news did not fly as fast as the wings of a dragon, and it had not yet reached Dawn. However, the Emperor's return from Dawn on a dragon and the body of John Connington, the former Prime Minister, still caused an uproar in King's Landing. People talked about Dawn's audacity and speculated whether a larger scale war would break out in the future. His Majesty was furious and led his 8 dragons to burn every inch of Dawn. There were even people with bad intentions who secretly speculated whether His Majesty would abolish his Dornish queen and entrust the church to cancel the sacred marriage, or he would remove Oberyn's military power and drive this Dornish prince, who was in a very high position, back to his hometown. After all, Oberyn's army was now guarding the capital. Although Oberyn's army is stationed in the King's Wood and cannot reach the city in an instant, and the walls of King's Landing are high, the city is guarded by thousands of elite unsullied troops and the capital garrison led by Sir Blackfish Brynden Tully. But in the current political environment, it is still more or less unsettling to use a Prince of Dawn to guard the capital of the Empire. At the same time, the Prime Minister died on the battlefield, and the next Prime Minister has become the focus of attention from all parties. Chapter 684, Linking Souls. However, the Emperor's actions after his return disappointed all those who were watching the show. He did not depose his queen because of the rebellion in Dawn, nor did he doubt Oberyn, who had followed him since he was a nobody, and his loyalty was shaken. After Viserys returned to King's Landing, he locked himself in the Red Keep, along with the body of Jon Connington, the Prime Minister. Even the ministers of the Council of the King were not qualified to see the body of the Prime Minister. People began to doubt whether Jon Connington's death was true, but then the news came out from the court, and then they believed it. A servant in the court saw Jon Connington's body with his own eyes, claiming that his surface was covered with a layer of frost, but he was still lifelike, as if he was asleep. Those who were watching the show in the Empire were disappointed to see this scene. They thought that the Emperor was scared and afraid of Dawn, and was afraid of repeating the War of Aegon's invasion of Dawn. However, the dragon then burned down the city of Sky and Sky. The ancient and glorious Fowler family, the King of the Cliff and the Sky, the other family of Hellgate, who had shot Aegon's little queen Rhaenys, and the Codgel family of Sandston were all wiped out from this world. The news came back to King's Landing, and these people were frightened, and the rumors were naturally broken. It is even said that Viserys did not go to Sunspear in person, but only sent a letter to the Water Gardens, asking Prince Doran to come to the Iron Throne to explain the matter. Prince Doran, who had stayed in the Water Gardens for decades because of gout, was silent for a long time after receiving the letter. Finally, he decided to go to the Iron Throne in person to explain according to the decree of His Majesty the Emperor. Now he has boarded a warship from Sunspear and sailed to Blackwater Bay. In the cellar of the Red Castle, it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. This place was used to store dragon bones during the Baratheon dynasty, but now Viserys has locked himself up here, and Jon Connington's body is also imprisoned here with him. The news leaked from the Red Castle was accidentally seen by a servant when he came in to deliver food. Although Viserys now only needs to eat a very small amount of food to maintain some satiety, he no longer needs to get nutrition from food, but he still maintains human habits. At this moment, the lights in the underground world are dim, and the swaying firelight illuminates the side face of the silver-haired young man. He holds a ball of unpredictable black fog in his palm. In front of him is Jon's coffin, and there is a faceless stone statue next to him. Mirror says, "What do you want me to do?" Viserys looked at the unpredictable black fog in his palm, then tilted his head slightly and asked, "Now the cellar of the entire Red Castle is empty." Viserys seems to be talking to the air, and his voice keeps echoing in the empty environment. Fortunately, no one came in at this time and saw this scene, otherwise they would probably be scared out of their wits. And the next day, there will be rumors that His Majesty the Emperor has gone insane, and the blood of Mad King Aerys II carries the gene of mental illness. But others could not see the black mist in Viserys' palm, nor could they hear the voice of the woman in the stone statue. After hearing Viserys' words, Merryxes spoke calmly. "Use your mental power to touch this soul and wrap it with the fire of faith. Be careful. Viserys' mental power has been close to that of a god. After consuming the power of the old gods, his mental power is too strong. Jon Connington's soul is constantly changing its form, which is a manifestation of extreme fear. Now in the vision of Jon's soul, it is like an ant seeing an elephant lying on the ground and observing itself, so it can't help trembling instinctively. Merryxes reminded Viserys to be careful and wrap it with the divine fire, just to ensure that Jon Connington's soul would not be torn apart at the moment of contact. Viserys was somewhat glad that he had resisted his curiosity at the beginning, otherwise he would not be able to save people, but would instead cause Jon to be torn apart. Jon. Then Viserys carefully contacted Jon Connington's soul and said hello. However, the black fog seemed to be frightened by something, and it trembled all over, and even its color became much darker. After a while, a faint response came from it, which was surprised and happy, with a strong sense of disbelief. Your Majesty? Jon Connington's soul was in a daze, and had no consciousness, until he was awakened by Viserys. However, his memory still stayed at the moment before his death. He led the soldiers to the city of Shizuka, but because of negligence, he encountered the enemy's counterattack, and was shot in the chest by a cold arrow, and then died on the spot. Jon Connington also regretted his underestimation of the enemy and his reckless advance in his dying moments. He was not afraid of death, but he felt sorry for his newly married wife and the child who had just been pregnant, and had not seen the world. After helping Viserys unify the Seven Kingdoms, Jon Connington was awarded the title of Storm's End and the position of Governor of the Stormlands. After he settled down, he listened to the introduction of others, and chose a wife who was well matched. Bess Bracken, the niece of Riverland Governor Geoffrey Bracken and the fourth daughter of his brother Jandis Bracken, has just reached her first period, and has just come of age. She is also considered an old man and a young wife. Viserys approved the marriage between the two families under his command, so the two completed their wedding at the beginning of this year, and Viserys personally attended Jon Connington's wedding. Because her husband worked in the royal council, Bess followed her husband to King's Landing after marriage, and lived in the Prime Minister's tower. Before Jon led his army on the expedition, Bess was already pregnant with the heir of the Clinton family of Storm's End, and it has been several months now. Jon left this world with regret and guilt. His soul left his body, and was attracted by some characteristics of Viserys, and came into his hands until Viserys reawakened him. However, from Jon's perspective, this is indeed a bit too scary. At the same time, although he knew that His Majesty mastered mysterious magic, he did not expect Viserys to have the ability to control souls. Now he is very clear about his state of soul. It's me. Jon, what's that over there? Viserys nodded slightly, and then couldn't help asking. However, his question made the other party silent instantly. Chapter 685 Two Choices. There is nothing over there, Your Majesty. Jon Connington was silent for a long time, then shook his head and spoke. He didn't know what words to use to describe it, and finally paused for a long time, and then said the closest word. It's pitch black. Nothingness. Jon Connington did go to the world over there, but for him, that feeling could not be described in simple words, so he could only tell Viserys this way. Nothingness? And this was the first time in Viserys' past life that he had talked to someone who had died and then returned, which naturally aroused his interest. But when he heard Jon Connington's words, his brows relaxed slightly, and he secretly had a few more guesses in his heart. Maybe there is no other side, Your Majesty. I just feel that I have fallen into darkness. Jon Connington could not use words to describe his situation after death, and all those illusions and nothingness seemed to stop at his lips. And Viserys fell silent after hearing this. He knew that Jon had no need to deceive himself about this question, so there was no need for him to continue asking. Then what should I do next? Mirror this? Then, under the dim bonfire, the silver-haired young man sitting in the center of the red castle's cellar tilted his lavender eyes slightly, looked at the stone statue on the ground and asked. It was not until then that Jon Connington realized that there was a third person in the cellar. A faceless stone statue was quietly looking at him, which once again made him feel terrified. He had never believed in these ghosts and gods before, but it was not until he died that his eyes were opened. He was the weakest of the three people present. Even when Jon was just awakened by Viserys, he saw such a huge spiritual power that he almost thought he had seen the seven gods. Thinking of this, Jon couldn't help but shake his head with some self-mockery. It turned out that he had been the Prime Minister for so many years and thought he knew Viserys best, but now he found that His Majesty was far more mysterious than he had imagined. However, at this time, Viserys suddenly asked, and there was silence in the stone statue on the other side, and a woman's voice responded. Then, I don't know. You don't know either? Why didn't you say so earlier? Viserys frowned again when he heard this. Because gathering souls is not Meryx's job, have you forgotten her name? Meryx is the god of the sea in the Valyrian mythology system. The abbreviated version of his full name is the Lord of the Sea, who controls the ocean and storms. Therefore, according to Dr. Marwyn, a maester who has studied Valyria's history, sailors from the Valyria freehold used to offer sacrifices to Meryxes before going out to sea, praying for calm waters. Valyrian is the god of death, and he is responsible for gathering all the dead souls. Whether they died unjustly, died of old age, died of illness, or died of war, all souls are controlled by him. He is the end point of all life in this land of Valyria. Meryxes spoke calmly, explaining the job of the god of death. However, Viserys felt more and more familiar when he heard Meryx's words. Isn't it true that my ability to absorb souls overlaps with Valyrian's duties? Where did the Valyrian god of death go? Then the silver-haired young man asked in a slightly urgent voice, but there was no answer from the statue. Sorry. Viserys also took a deep breath and waved his hand. He knew that he was a little impatient, because Meryxes once said that she didn't know what happened at that time, how the powerful Valyrian gods were taken away by the enemy in one wave. She was just an inconspicuous divine thought that Meryxes deposited in the statue. You need to calm down. However, Meryxes then slowly spoke. You must have a secret hidden in you. I know, but your progress is too fast. You need to stop temporarily and calmly examine the past. Meryxes didn't know what secrets Viserys was hiding, but a mortal who could reach this step must have an opportunity behind him. Her kind reminder made Viserys calm down instantly. Since he can't be resurrected, what should we do with Jon's soul? I know there are two ways. Meryxes saw Viserys calm down, and then spoke. The first is to become a wandering ghost like me, relying on the fire of faith in your body as nourishment to survive. He can't control his dead body, nor can he be too far away from you. But the spirit has its own advantages. He can still give you wise advice, and can also help you find out secrets, or possess other living people. Ghost advisor? Guardian spirit? Viserys couldn't help but have such thoughts in his mind when he heard Meryx's first method. Because this is indeed like a guardian spirit, and there is no limit to the lifespan. As long as he can absorb enough soul nutrients, he can live forever like Meryx's. Of course, the premise of doing this is that Viserys' divine fire is always burning. What about the second method? Viserys thought for a moment, without comment, and then asked. The second method is rebirth. Find a pregnant woman who has not yet given birth, and send his soul into her body. The process of a newborn baby growing in the mother's body is the birth of life. The baby in the mother's belly has not yet formed its own soul, and his soul can replace it. Can't reincarnate? These two methods don't seem to be perfect. Viserys heard about Meryx's second method, and then turned his head to look at Jon's soul in his palm. Jon's wife happened to be pregnant with his flesh and blood, so he could choose this method to live another life. Reincarnation? Meryxes was slightly stunned when he heard this, and didn't understand what Viserys said, but then he thought about it, and roughly understood it through the literal meaning. There is no reincarnation. Every newborn is a brand new soul, and every dead person's soul will eventually dissipate. Is that so? Viserys showed a thoughtful look on his face. Meryxes was not omniscient and omnipotent, and she only knew part of it, which he knew. Because if all souls dissipate, it cannot explain why the cold god resurrected the successive kings of the north. Logically, some of their souls have spanned thousands of years, and should have been reduced to ashes long ago. But Viserys did not ask directly, and then cast his eyes on Jon Connington's soul in his palm again. He decided to give him the right to choose. Should he choose to be a lonely ghost, or live a new life? Chapter 686 Funeral. The death of the King's Hand in Dorne is no small matter. However, the rebellion in Dorne has been quelled, and all the criminals involved have received due punishment, which can be regarded as allowing the deceased to rest in peace and the family and friends of the deceased to get some comfort. A few days later, there was a drizzle. The streets of King's Landing were washed clean by the rain, and in front of the gate of the Red Castle, two teams of people stood in the rain with sad faces, and a huge and gorgeous coffin was placed in the middle. Lying in it was the body of the former Prime Minister Jon Connington. Jon Connington's widow, Lady Bess of the Bracken family, was crying under an umbrella with a big belly. After Viserys ascended the throne as the Emperor of Valyria, Irion, who was promoted to the Queen of the Empire, also wore a solemn long dress, with a graceful and elegant temperament, standing under an umbrella. She also had a coat of arms of the Targaryen family on her chest, because according to the custom here, marrying into another family can be regarded as a member of this family. Irion can be called Irion Targaryen, and can also be called Irion Numerous Martel. At this moment, the elegant queen is whispering to comfort the girl beside her. Lady Bess Clinton's face is still very young, with a bulging belly. It seems that she has just come of age and married John Clinton, the Prime Minister, under the arrangement of her uncle. In fact, this is a very good marriage. Bess is not sad, because John is twice her age, because John Clinton is only in his 30s now, in his prime, not an old man without any ability. Moreover, John is the Prime Minister and the Governor of Stormlands. In other words, if the girl's uncle is not the Lord of the Sea and the Governor of the Riverlands, Geoffrey Bracken, John may not be able to look down on her. John's character is conservative and traditional. He does not need a wife who is as beautiful as a flower. He only needs a woman who can match his status and can carry on the family line. Bess is just the right person. Irion took on her responsibility as the queen, holding the girl's hand and whispering comfort. If someone else came to persuade her, it might not have any good effect, but the conversation between women would undoubtedly open their hearts quickly. On the other side, Viserys was also dressed solemnly, and the metal emblem on his left chest shone slightly under the rain. He was standing beside John Connington's coffin without an umbrella, and beside him were a Baron, Varys and others. His Majesty the Emperor was drenched in the rain without an umbrella. Except for the Queen and the Prime Minister's wife and other female relatives, the others naturally did not dare to hold an umbrella. They all lowered their heads to express their condolences, whether sincerely or falsely. In front of John Connington's coffin, the Archbishop of the Great Sept of St. Bela and the Dean of King's Landing Seminary. He was fat and wore a crystal crown on his head. He held the lid of the coffin with one hand, muttering something in his mouth and breathing heavily. After the fat archbishop finished his eulogy, John Connington's coffin was lifted up by several unsullied soldiers and placed on the carriage. "Get ready, get ready." With a few shouts, the convoy escorting John Connington's coffin officially drove out of the Red Keep. Viserys and other princes and ministers did not choose to walk, but each rode on horses and sedan chairs to keep up with the team. I didn't expect John to die in Dawn. Among the princes and ministers of the empire, those who were familiar with archery and horse riding chose to ride horses, and those who were fat or weak and could not get wet in the rain, such as the Minister of Finance Illyrio, quickly got into the sedan chair. At this moment, a Baron was still wearing a sandy yellow battle robe, riding his black warhorse, urging the horse to catch up with Viserys, and then spoke. It has been a few days since Viserys returned from Dawn, but Viserys has been very busy these days, locking himself in the cellar of the Red Keep. No one knows what he is doing, and a Baron did not talk to Viserys. Yeah, I didn't expect that either. Viserys, a Baron, John Connington and others are old friends. They fought together in Essos, and were tied to the chariot of the Targaryen family. Viserys was the driver of the chariot, and these important ministers were the wheels of the chariot. They rose together and fell together. Therefore, although many people slandered Viserys after the unification of the Seven Kingdoms, trying to pry the status of a Baron, John, Bessie and other founding ministers and generals, it had no effect. Viserys was not the kind of person who would hide his bows when the birds were gone, and cook his running dogs when the rabbits died. Those who followed him to start a business, even Ramsay Bolton, who was not liked by anyone, also received due rewards. Viserys and a Baron braved the drizzling rain in the sky, like two old friends, talking and walking, and others were left with deep envy for such a relationship between the monarch and the ministers. When my brother comes to King's Landing, I will tell him what to do. At this time, a Baron looked at a little boy wiping his nose in the crowd of curious onlookers on the street, then turned his head and spoke to Viserys. Before this incident, a Baron had sent a message to his brother, but it was obvious that Prince Doran did not accept his advice. Then he suffered a great loss. The three families of Dawn who were loyal to Martel were destroyed. The Martel family, known as Indomitable, was severely slapped in the face. Prince Doran himself even had to come to King's Landing to apologize. Oberyn had already known that his brother was about to go north to King's Landing. Yeah. Viserys was also drenched in the drizzle, with raindrops sliding down his cheeks. He held the reins in his hand, then nodded, and said nothing more. Your Majesty the Emperor. The people watching the excitement around cheered regardless of the occasion. Those who didn't know thought it was a good thing, and then they were driven away by the soldiers of the Unsullied Legion and the capital garrison. Jon Connington's coffin left the Red Keep and headed along the avenue to the King's Landing Military Academy on the Rena's Hill, where his body would be buried. Because the decision to split the city into several colleges was supported by Jon Connington, and he put forward many constructive suggestions, which was one of his brilliant achievements during his tenure. Therefore, Jon Connington's burial in the King's Landing Military Academy is also of commemorative significance. On the streets, washed clean by rain, the sound of horse hooves, wheels, cheers of the surrounding people, and the sound of driving were intertwined, and then slowly drowned in the vast rain curtain. Chapter 687 Prime Minister Candidate. Oberyn was not involved in this. I believe Prince Doran is not such a fool. Beside Viserys, there was an illusory shadow floating between the two people. Jon Connington looked at his wife with a sad look, and then cast on Oberyn. Oberyn was his good friend. Although the two had a little conflict on the issue of suppressing the rebellion, Jon Connington never denied it. However, now think about it, if Oberyn had led the troops to Dorne to suppress the rebellion instead of himself, would it have been smoother? At least Oberyn's identity is special. He is the Prince of Dorne. He led the soldiers to arrest the criminals of the Iron Throne. No one from the Dorne family, except the Fowler family, dared to participate in it, let alone shelter and protect the Fowler family. The prestige of the Martell family in Dorne is still very high. It may even be possible to directly ask Franklin Fowler to surrender without bloodshed. Then he was taken to King's Landing for trial. Considering the plot of surrendering, he might get a chance to wear black clothes. Isn't this a better solution? No. Of course not. Jon Connington knew that the fundamental problem between Dorne and the Iron Throne was not these. Otherwise the attitude of Prince Doran, the father-in-law of His Majesty the Emperor, would not be unpredictable. Because this involves the fundamental interests of Dorne, which is almost equivalent to conquering Dorne without bloodshed. The Martell family is unwilling to kneel down and surrender without a single move, otherwise their family language would not be called unyielding. Although Jon Connington encountered some obstacles when he led his army to the expedition, he showed the current military power of the Iron Throne and broke the fantasy of some Dorne nobles. As long as he successfully withdrew his troops, Dorne's problems could be solved safely. But the problem lies with himself. He accidentally died on the battlefield. In order to avenge him and vent his anger, Viserys killed and burned the castle, which led to the situation behind him and broke the original plan of him and Viserys. Well, however, I believe that few people can visit their own funerals in their lifetime. Then Jon Connington said self-deprecatingly, it seems that after a few days, he has walked out of the haze of the past and has become a little more optimistic. His soul floated in the same place, and Robb, the squire beside Viserys, shivered slightly, feeling the cold wind around him, and a little chill on the back of his neck. You are dead. Not in your lifetime. Viserys was still standing in the newly built garden behind the Imperial Military Academy. It was still drizzling here, and the ground was green with grass and many flowers and plants. Now the soldiers have dug a big pit in advance, and are struggling to lift Jon Connington's coffin from the carriage. Ah, Your Majesty, who are you talking to? However, Viserys suddenly spoke to the air, which scared the red-haired boy who was feeling cold and uncomfortable beside him. On the other side, Queen Irian, who was holding Lady Bess's hand with one hand and holding her long skirt with the other hand, also looked over here. She didn't know what these men were talking about, but it was obvious that the sudden death of the king's hand in Dorne, who was in his prime, made many ambitious people start to stir. The selection of the next prime minister must go through a bloody storm. Don't be sad, sister. Think about the good side. Fortunately, you are pregnant with Lord Connington's flesh and blood, otherwise the foundation of Storm's End. Then Irian turned around and continued to comfort the heartbroken girl beside her. We are all very sad about Lord Jon's unexpected death, Your Majesty. Jon Connington's coffin was very heavy. The soldiers shouted slogans and lifted it with ropes and put it into the pit dug in advance. At this moment, there was still some water in the pit because of the rain. A soldier slipped and accidentally fell into the dog's shit, but fortunately there was no serious injury. However, at this moment, Varys, the Minister of Intelligence, who was also watching the ceremony nearby and wearing a large robe, walked towards Viserys and spoke. "Lord Oberyn." He then greeted Oberyn next to Viserys and then spoke directly without any reservations. "But the position of the Prime Minister is of great importance. He is your Majesty's right-hand man and the most important assistant minister in the entire empire. So although I don't want to mention it at this time, please forgive me. I still want to ask your Majesty, what should be done next? Is there a suitable candidate?" Jon Clyndow died unexpectedly on the battlefield, and the issue of the next Prime Minister must be put on the agenda. During this period, many people in the court have begun to secretly operate relationships, hoping to get a share of the pie. The ministers in the court include Minister of Agriculture Alistair Florent and others. He united a group of nobles and had the support of the former feudal Lord Tyrell family. Since hearing the news of Jon's death, he began to covet the position of the next prime minister. Alistair Florent thought that he was the oldest and had rich experience and could help His Majesty govern the country. Even the governors of other regions have joined the competition, such as the commander of the Golden Company of the Westerlands, Miles Toyne, Euron Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, and Littlefinger of the Vale. They all think that they have a good understanding of governing the country and can become the right-hand man of His Majesty the Emperor. At the same time, there are some voices in the political situation of King's Landing, which are the two former prime ministers. They hope to choose one of the two retired prime ministers to wear the medal of the King's Hand again and return to their original position. However, the two former prime ministers of the Targaryen family, one is a man of rich experience but too old, and the other is the unpopular Prince of Dorne. Among those who hold this part of the voice, a considerable number of people are Dornish, and the rest of the people can't stand the Dornish and are unwilling to support Oberyn, so these voices supporting the return of the former prime minister are full of division. However, among them, Miles Toyne is one of the closest candidates, and he has the highest possibility of becoming the next prime minister. Although the leader of the Golden Group was born as a mercenary, he was ugly, dark and ugly, but he also had the noble blood of the Toyne family. Moreover, he had an upright character. During his leadership of the Golden Group, he united all the brothers, and was full of leadership. In his bones, he was a fair and firm warrior. When Jon Connington was wandering in Essos, he was the deputy of Miss Toyne. The two were good friends who could talk about anything. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 688 Villas. Varys' question was very straightforward. On the other side, Oberyn, who was also standing in the rain, turned his head and looked at Viserys. He didn't mind wearing the medal of the King's Hand again, but judging from the current rejection of the Dornish in the King's Landing, it might cause a lot of controversy. After all, Jon Connington died while suppressing the Dornish rebellion, and then a Dornish prime minister was appointed. This was a bit unreasonable. It seemed that the Dornish rebelled, but did not receive any punishment. And it didn't fit Oberyn's plan for himself. Oberyn had a keen sense of smell. He sensed the danger and knew when to retreat. Long before he was criticized more and more, he had already made it clear that he should keep a low profile in recent years. Otherwise, a big tree will attract wind, and sooner or later it will attract jealousy, and reappointing as the prime minister will definitely be a very ostentatious one. It's not appropriate to discuss this matter now. We'll discuss it later. However, Viserys' face was calm, and the cold rain flowed down his hair. He took a deep breath, waved his hand and spoke. On the other side, Jon Connington's coffin had been officially placed in the pit, after spending some effort. Now several soldiers were holding shovels to start burying it, and on the other side a huge stone tablet was also hoisted up, and ready to be erected on this tomb. Please forgive me. When Varys saw Viserys' attitude, he immediately realized that His Majesty was a little unhappy in his heart, and he didn't dare to ask any more questions. "Your Majesty." The grey rain curtain did not stop, and rain was constantly flowing on his shiny head. Then he bowed slightly and left. John Connington's funeral and memorial service were held together, although this was somewhat inconsistent with etiquette. After all, the Prime Minister was an important position in the imperial system. When such a person dies, the bells of the Cathedral of St. Bela will ring for at least a few days, and the monks will light candles and pray day and night until the 7 gods absorb the soul into heaven. There will even be a grand banquet with rich food and wine, and people will raise their glasses together at the banquet to express their remembrance of the deceased. However, all these complicated and cumbersome procedures have been simplified. Viserys only asked the craftsman to carve a tombstone, and the epitaph on it was the ups and downs of John Clinton's life. Then he found a beautiful Feng Shui treasure land in the military academy, and then buried it directly. There was no grand ceremony during the period. It was simple, not like the funeral of a prime minister, but like an ordinary small noble family. Because these were all John Clinton's own requests. He didn't want to be a prop used by others after his death, and he didn't want others to hold glasses and toast at his memorial service. It's better to be simple than to be so complicated and wasteful. About the next prime minister. John, what suggestions do you have? After the prime minister's funeral, Viserys returned to the Red Keep Meagher's tower. He was sitting in his study at the moment, and there was no one guarding the door. Rob, as a servant, seemed to have caught a cold after being caught in the rain, so he was driven away to rest, and then Viserys asked. He didn't want to spread the fact that he could control souls, otherwise it might cause some unnecessary trouble. After all, no one in this world wants to die. And Viserys' consultation with John Connington was actually an unspoken rule that had been passed down from the Targaryen dynasty. If the previous prime minister could step down safely, he could recommend the candidate he approved to the king before leaving. Of course, this only played a role in recommendation, and the final decision was still in the hands of the king. And John Connington heard Viserys' words and hesitated for a moment. In fact, his occupational disease had come back. After becoming a soul, John Connington couldn't sit still. He actually thought about this problem these days. However, after much deliberation, there are only a few suitable candidates. Mistoyne is okay, Your Majesty. He is a fair and determined warrior, but his identity has become an obstacle to him. As a man who has always been honorable, John Connington gave his friend a high evaluation, and Mistoyne is also the best choice. Lord Petty Baelish, the governor of the Vale, is also very capable. It's just that he is too scheming, and he will do anything to get things done. John Connington recognized Littlefinger's ability. Petty Baelish is definitely a rare talent. Whether it is in power struggles or alliances, governing a piece of land is what he is least good at. However, John Connington is quite contemptuous of Petty Baelish's character. As the Prime Minister, he naturally knows the governors of various places, and sometimes the intelligence compiled by the Minister of Intelligence and the Ministry of Internal Affairs will come to him. Littlefinger can get to this point naturally without the use of his current wife Lyssa. He will do anything to get things done, and everyone can become his pawn. Eddard Stark is also a good candidate, but it's a pity that he wears black. John Connington spoke again. In fact, it is not difficult to see that his criteria for selecting people put ability in the second place, and the first priority is loyalty and reliability. Mistoyne and Eddard Stark are both candidates who may not be very capable, but they attach great importance to honor, loyalty and reliability. However, at this moment, John Connington suddenly proposed another candidate. And this person was not even expected by Viserys before, so he couldn't help but turn his head slightly and look at the other party. Willis of the Tyrrell family. I wonder if Your Majesty still remembers him? Willis once led the army of the Riverland and almost defeated the Dawn army led by Earl Ironwood, the guardian of the Bone Road, in Star Shuttle City. He is also a suitable candidate. He is well-read, knowledgeable, and hard-working, but he works tirelessly and devotes himself to his work. Willis Tyrrell now works in the tax department of the Empire, and his work attitude and ability are absolutely recognized by everyone. Although he had difficulty walking and often needed to use a cane, he worked tirelessly every day, doing many things by himself. Willis personally went to the port and the caravan owner to explain the new policy, and his ability was also outstanding, recovering a large amount of taxes for the treasury of the empire. John Clinton had observed Willis's performance after he came to the capital, so he saw all of this. Chapter 689 Tax Farmer System. My lord, this is a tax record of the wool merchant in Eel Lane. Early in the morning, a tax officer under Willis brought a thick record. The Iron Throne has been promoting economic reforms, but the speed is relatively slow compared to other aspects. John Connington is a prime minister with relatively outstanding comprehensive abilities. He can unite the front in wartime and govern the country in peacetime. During his time as prime minister, he quelled rebellions and invasions in all directions. In terms of economic reform, John Connington has always advocated stability as the main thing and tried not to cause too much turmoil. Therefore, economic reforms in John's era have always been tepid, while wars have been fought in full swing, which is also a personal characteristic of him. However, John's time in charge of the Council of the King was not without achievements in the economy. For example, he advocated the abolition of the tax farmer system that had lasted for hundreds and thousands of years in Westeros. The tax farmer system is a person who is entrusted by the royal family to collect taxes indirectly. The contractor pays the tax in advance and then obtains the royal taxation right and then collects taxes from the taxpayers. John Clinton believes that the tax farmer system is full of loopholes, chaos, sin, and violation of honor. It even nourishes many social dregs and forms a black and evil force in King's Landing. Because many tax farmers will take some extreme measures to extort merchants after obtaining the right to collect taxes from the royal family, such as beating, smashing, robbing, burning, personal threats, provoking trouble, and disrupting the normal business order. Even in the end, the money extorted from merchants is much higher than the normal tax, and these poor merchants still need to pay a protection fee to the gold cloaks at that time, otherwise they will encounter troubles from the gold cloaks. The merchants who operate normally and legally in King's Landing face these layers of exploitation, and basically their profits have been squeezed out. There is little left, so they are forced to raise prices and pass the pressure on ordinary civilians. This is why in the Baratheon dynasty and even the old Targaryen dynasty, once there was a war or other changes, prices soared before anything else happened. Because the royal family was in urgent need of money, they immediately collected taxes for the next few years from the tax farmers, and the tax farmers then collected more taxes from the merchants, and finally the prices in King's Landing suddenly took off and soared into the sky. Tax farmers, who were once very special legal merchants under the Chancellor of the Exchequer, collected money from both ends. On the one hand, they received preferential royal tax payments as their reward, and on the other hand, they took more oil and water from the merchants, and naturally made a lot of money. But the merchants who operated normally without any background or backing and the ordinary people in King's Landing were scarred. John Connington hated the evil forces in King's Landing since he first served as the Prime Minister during the reign of the Mad King Era's second. How could he, a person who hated evil and could not tolerate any sand in his eyes, watch this group of people do evil? However, although John Connington was the Prime Minister of the Mad King at that time, he did not have any opportunity to show his strength, because he did not get the support of a wise master. But in the era of Viserys, he returned to King's Landing and got this opportunity to show his strength. Therefore, in terms of economic reform and national internal affairs, John first abolished the tax farmer system, but the tax farmer system was ultimately a convenient way for the royal family to collect taxes. After the tax farmer system was abolished, the tax officials of the empire became busy all of a sudden. From now on, there would be no ruffians to help them collect taxes, and they could only rely on their mouths to make those greedy merchants pay the taxes they should pay. Whenever the tax officials were exhausted from work, they couldn't help but miss the former ruffians. Unfortunately, they had all been sent to prison by Lord John Clinton, and some had even gone north to the Great Wall or died. The tax officer under Willis handed him a tax record of a wool merchant in the city. This was written by a tax officer during the Baratheon dynasty, but now the tax officer is guarding the border on the Great Wall in the cold wind. Although John Connington abolished the tax farmer system, and the city guards were purged internally and trained by the commander of the Unsullied Legion, Blackworm, for a year, and now the commander is Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, the military discipline is much stricter, and the business of merchants in King's Landing is no longer as difficult as before. But merchants are merchants, and they will fight for every penny of profit. Therefore, although there are no tax farmers and gold cloaks, it is more difficult to collect taxes. They will find all kinds of reasons to argue with the tax officials in King's Landing. And now this wool merchant in Eel Lane is a tough opponent. Willis has visited him twice in person, but to no avail. The other party claimed that his taxes had been paid 30 years later during the reign of King Robert, so he did not need to pay taxes now. My lord, are we going there today? This old guy doesn't listen to what we say at all. He is just making a fuss. A tax officer under Willis asked indignantly while leaning against the table. What do you mean his taxes have been paid for 30 years? How can King Robert and His Majesty the Emperor be the same thing? King Robert is extravagant and squanders money, while His Majesty the Emperor is frugal and fair. I suggest that you notify Lord Brynden Tully directly and send someone to seal up his shop. Although the tax officials of the Empire cannot use all kinds of looting, threats and inducements like the hooligans in the past, they still have an ultimate killer weapon, which is to notify the Capitol Guards to send people to seal up the merchant's shop. Not necessary for the time being. Willis Tyrrell, who was sitting behind his desk flipping through the tax record, finally finished reading it at this time. He thought for a moment, then shook his head and spoke. Then the brown-haired young man raised his hand and pointed to several records on the account book. These all happened during the reign of King Robert a few years ago, when the War of the Invasion of the White Walkers broke out. Old Lenman didn't lie. He has indeed paid the taxes for 30 years later. At that time, the Iron Throne was heavily in debt. However, in order to gather soldiers for the war, it repeatedly borrowed money from everywhere, squeezing the people's fat and blood. The people suffered terribly, and this wool merchant from the north was one of the victims. Chapter 690 Bank. What should we do? Lord Willis, are we not going to collect the taxes from old Linman? But how should we record this in the books? Besides, there is Lord Harris, the steward of the 4 treasurers and the royal accountant. The tax officer under Willis was a little anxious when he heard what his superior said. If it was just a wool merchant, the taxes would not be much, but the difficulty was how to explain this to the steward of the 4 treasurers and the royal accountant. There was no way to record it in the books. After all, the new dynasty had already cut off ties with the previous dynasty. His Majesty even rode a dragon to burn Bravus, and even owed millions of gold dragons to the largest creditor, the Iron Bank. All of a sudden, the remaining creditors, such as the Tirosh merchants, the Lannisters, the Tyrrells, and the Hightowers, died or declined, and those who survived by chance did not dare to come to collect the debts. The policy of the Iron Throne is to start over, so no matter whether it is old accounts or past taxes, they will not be recognized. If you have the ability, you can come to the Iron Throne to ask Viserys in person to collect the debts. There is a precedent for the old Linman case. He is not the only one who has not paid taxes for 30 years. When Willis heard his subordinate's words, he waved his hand and told him to be patient. He casually flipped through the book in his hand and then closed it. But he was thinking about the news that Finance Minister Illyrio told him a few days ago. He had a plan in his heart and then spoke. We can't make false accounts and no one will pay the taxes for old Linman. The money must be collected. I will talk to him in person. Willis broke his leg when he fell off the horse in a duel with a Barin when he was young, so his legs and feet have always been inconvenient. He climbed onto the carriage embroidered with golden roses with a cane, and he was followed by several followers of the Tyrrell family. The carriage was extremely comfortable and expensive. After all, Willis is now the face of the Tyrrell family in Star Shuttle City, Ealalie. Then he explained, and the coachman nodded in response, and then the wheels rolled and drove towards the destination. Eel Lane is located in Vasenire Hills, which is also named in memory of the Great Queen. Vasenire Hills is a commercial district in King's Landing, with many shops and mainly inhabited by some middle class and even lower middle class families in King's Landing. The carriage of the Tyrrell family drove to Eel Lane and attracted the attention of the residents here because everyone in King's Landing knew that the Tyrrell family was still very rich and profound despite the hardships they suffered and should not be underestimated. This was the result of Miss Marguerite Tyrrell's crazy spending of money, and this was also the idea of Lady Elena, the Queen of Thorns. If the Tyrrell family does not pretend to be strong, those jackals will not be able to help but pounce on them. However, the residents of Eel Lane only saluted the carriage of the Tyrrell family and did not rush up to ask for awards like the poor people in Flea Bottom, because the income level of the residents here is still good in King's Landing. The carriage of the Tyrrell family stopped in front of a store in Eel Lane that looked pretty good, and then Willis jumped off the carriage with the help of his servants, leaning on his cane. Where did the wind come from that blew Lord Willis here? I smelled the scent of roses from a long distance away. The young man with brown hair and a cane in his hand was wearing decent clothes, with a golden rose embroidered on his chest and a ruby ring on his finger. He walked into the woolen products store with a cane, and an obese old man with half white hair hurried out to greet him. He was a wool merchant from White Harbor, responsible for ezzling woolen products from the north to King's Landing. However, business is not good now. The North was originally a place rich in wool, but because of the invasion of the White Walkers, the North fell, so old Linman was forced to import expensive wool from the trading city-states to process it himself. Money is worthless, prices go up, and people have no money. These three factors are like a mountain pressing down on us, and all of old Linman's savings have been lost. Old Linman has been running this store in King's Landing for decades, starting from the time of Mad King Era's II. He has accumulated a lot of savings and has continued to grow bigger and stronger. At that time, the Mad King was notorious and often burned nobles. Old Linman also felt disgusted and denounced him as a tyrant. However, until the rebels he supported broke into King's Landing and burned, killed, and looted, most of old Linman's family business was instantly robbed away. Later, Robert Baratheon, the leader of the rebels who became king, levied heavy taxes and was licentious. 30 years after the tax was collected, old Linman's family fortune was completely ruined. He almost hanged himself. However, it has not been until now that it has gradually returned to normal, but the wool production base in the north has not yet recovered, and it is necessary to import expensive wool from the trading city-states. Although the market has returned to normal, it is still a good thing to save a little. After all, he paid taxes for 30 years. Old Linman was unwilling to give up and still had a fluke mentality. Now there are no tax farmers to make trouble, but he is still a little uncomfortable. When the tax farmers messed with the merchants' countermeasure was to hire some mercenaries, use magic to defeat magic, and the ruffians and mercenaries fought against each other. Therefore, this time he also spent a little money to hire a few mercenaries, and every time the tax officials came, he used unreasonable means to drive them away. However, this time, Lord Willis of the Tyrrell family, the general accountant of the empire, came in person, and old Linman still did not dare to play tricks. He could only let the mercenaries hide aside and go out to greet him. After Willis came in, he did not greet him, but directly stated his purpose. Then old Linman's face changed, and he looked aggrieved, and then he complained loudly, hoping that the general tax director would be generous enough to exempt his taxes, because he paid such a pitiful amount. I really have no money, Lord Willis. I didn't lie to you. The half-white-haired old man looked aggrieved, and then took out the account book, showing that he valued money more than his life. Are you really out of money? However, Willis nodded slightly at the exaggerated performance of old Linman, and then asked seriously, yes, I really have no money. Old Linman didn't know what Willis meant by confirming again, so he could only scratch his hair and nod and repeat it. I have a way here that can let you borrow money at a very low interest rate. Do you know a bank? However, Willis spoke up. Chapter 691 New Currency. It was noon. The whole morning passed quickly, but when old Linman walked out of a very luxurious shop diagonally opposite the Alchemist Guild, he was still confused. Everything changed after he faced the sincere eyes of Lord Willis Tyrrell a few hours ago and nodded heavily. He was dragged here by the Empire's chief tax officer, and then signed a series of contracts, and finally borrowed a considerable amount of operating funds. The name seemed to be, to promote economic development or trade or rescue funds. Anyway, in the end, old Lenman successfully borrowed a sum of gold dragons at a very low interest rate. However, before this sum of gold dragons fell into his hands, Lord Willis, the chief tax officer, took away his taxes due next year. Later, he did not get the rest of the gold dragons because they were said to have all been saved. Old Lenman lowered his head slightly and looked at the thin black metal card in his hand. On it was engraved a giant dragon with its wings spread and roaring to the sky, and on the right was old Lenman's name, and there was a digital code in the lower right corner. 0173. Old Lenman couldn't help but read out loud the metal card. According to the lady who received him, he was the 173rd customer in the entire empire to hold an Imperial Bank savings card, which would have a high commemorative value in the future. However, old Lenman shuddered slightly and became much more clear-headed. It's not that he had never heard of this form of storage and lending, because it was said that the Iron Bank in Bravos across the Narrow Sea operated in this way, but this was the first time he saw it. The half-white-haired merchant had always been running the route between White Harbor and King's Landing. It was only in the past 2 years that he came into contact with people from the trading city-states, but he had never been out to sea. He just delivered the goods to King's Landing, and then he paid to buy them, and hired workers to process them, and then sold them as finished products. The empire also has its own Iron Bank. It was not until he walked out of the door and was blown by the cool breeze that old Lenman's mind became much clearer, and he also realized that this was the operating mode of the Iron Bank. However, old Lenman did not feel any joy. Thinking of the series of contracts he had just signed, he shuddered instead. Because although he was a northerner, he had lived in King's Landing for too many years. He knew the rulers of the Iron Throne too well. He could come up with an idea and make the whole country a mess. He suspected that the Imperial Bank was a half-finished product. It would not last long and then run away. His money would be wasted, and he had to pay back every penny of the loan and interest he owed. The most vivid example was the 30 years of taxes he paid during the reign of King Robert. No, I want my money back. Old Lenman shuddered and hurriedly ran back to the Imperial Bank with a very luxurious facade. This building was located in the center of King's Landing and was squeezed together with the Great Sept of St. Bela, the Imperial Seminary, the Imperial Medical School, the Alchemists Guild, etc. In the future, this place will inevitably belong to the economic and cultural center in the urban planning of King's Landing, and Egan High Hill will continue to be the political center, where several official residences of the royal ministers are being built. Although the facade of the Imperial Bank is very luxurious, with a hall as tall as a 3-story building, dozens of stone pillars supporting the dome, and the Royal Guard unsullied soldiers guarding the door, there is no plaque or sign. Ordinary people have been curious about this building since its construction, but they have not found out anything. Even after the building is built, no strangers are allowed to visit it, but all the people who come in and out here every day are the dignitaries in King's Landing. This can't help but arouse the curiosity of many ordinary people. They all want to know what this place is. There are even different opinions. Some people speculate that it is a place for nobles to enjoy themselves, and others speculate that it is a palace. However, now that old Lenman has just walked out of here, he ran back again, regardless of the strange looks of the dignitaries around him. Fortunately, the Imperial Bank has just started trial operation not long ago, and it is one of the key tasks of Finance Minister Illyrio, so not many people in King's Landing know about it, and there are many vacant windows. Old Lenman ran back to the window, where he had just deposited his money. Inside, a well-dressed red-haired woman was eating dried fruit. Seeing old Lenman coming back, she quickly put away her snacks and sat up straight. "Sir, what else do you have?" "Withdraw money. I want to withdraw money," old Lenman panted and said out of breath, fearing that if he ran a step slower, the little girl would take his money and run away. "Oh." The red-haired girl sitting at the window blinked slightly, as if she had some understanding, knowing what the other party was worried about. The Imperial Bank is now in trial operation. Those who come in and out here are all well-known officials in King's Landing. They may be skeptical about this, but they don't care about a small amount of money. And this old man was brought in by the chief tax officer, Lord Willis Tyrrell, who should not have been qualified to enter. However, she understood the other party's concerns in her heart, but on the surface, the girl still maintained a polite smile. This was one of the contents of the secret training. How much do you want to withdraw? However, this question stumped old Linman. He was just worried that the money he borrowed would disappear, but now he thought that it was Lord Villas who introduced him. If he took it out right after depositing it, wouldn't it be a clear distrust of Lord Villas? And this lord came from a prominent family and was the chief tax officer of the empire. If he knew about this, he would make things difficult for him. Thinking of this, old Lenman's face was uncertain, and he couldn't help stamping his feet, and made up his mind. Take 10 gold dragons. 10 gold dragons are a lot of wealth for an ordinary family in Junlin, but old Linman, as a businessman who has been in business for so many years, can still take it out, not to mention that he just borrowed much more money than this. Okay. However, the girl at the window did not hesitate. She took the metal card from old Linman's hand, then checked the number on it, found the account book starting with 3 digits, and finally deducted 10 gold dragons from the account for old Linman. Then 10 golden new gold dragons were placed in front of him. Please keep it. Goodbye. The girl at the window nodded politely. Chapter 692 Mint. Old Lenman stood in front of the counter window, but did not leave, staring blankly at the gold coin in his hand. First, he was relieved that he could withdraw money, and second, it was on this brand new gold coin. This was a kind of golden dragon that old Linman had never seen before. The front of it was still the emblem of the 3-headed dragon of the Targaryen family, and the back of this golden dragon depicted the profile of a silver-haired young man wearing a crown, heroic and valiant. This is. Old Linman hesitated a little when holding this golden dragon. With his many years of experience in business, he didn't need to touch it, just a glance to know that this gold coin was real. However, he had been doing business in King's Landing for so many years, but he had never seen this golden dragon. But the lady at the counter of the Imperial Bank immediately solved his doubts for him. This is the new money that the Empire is going to issue. You should be able to tell whether it is real or fake. Old Linman hesitated for a while and touched it again with his hand, then nodded slightly. This was indeed a real coin. He could confirm it, but he didn't expect that His Majesty would actually issue a batch of new money. After weighing them, they seemed to be about the same. He could not find any faults, so he put away the 10 new coins with doubt. But if you think about it carefully, there is nothing strange. His Majesty has changed the name of the country to Valyria and made a resolution to rebuild Valyria. He has to make a series of changes when he ascends the throne as the emperor. Although old Linman does not understand economics, it is not uncommon for the rulers of the Iron Throne to issue some new money. Demon Blackfire, Erizai, Darren II, Egan IV, etc. have all issued their own coins. In addition to the various coins used by the Seven Kingdoms before the Conquest War 300 years ago, and the pencils carried by customers of the free trade cities, the money currently circulating in the Seven Kingdoms is very mixed, with all kinds of money. There are gold dragons, silver moons, silver deer, copper stars, copper wheat, half copper wheat, copper cents, copper coins, and copper plates, etc. There are too many. When doing transactions, merchants will also flexibly adjust prices according to the type of coins that customers pay. Some gold coins do not have high gold content, while others are valuable, and the comprehensive exchange rate needs to be considered, which is really troublesome. Therefore, unifying the currency market and regulating the circulation of coins is also one of the tasks that Viserys gave to the Minister of Finance. Since Illyrio came to King's Landing from Pentus, there has not been a single day of leisure. Every day, he is busy running the construction of the bank, the mints of the 3 families in King's Landing, and the port of Blackwater Bay, the customs department, the tax department, etc. Therefore, the Minister of Finance Illyrio does not often attend the Royal Council, and his work is often vacant, including the Minister of War Cargo, who is now far away on the other side of the Narrow Sea. Cargo's military literacy is actually not very high. He is indeed rich in combat experience, but his knowledge is very lacking, and he can only command cavalry. Viserys gave Cargo the position of Minister of War just to better collect the loyalty of the Dothraki people. It is not really necessary to refer to Cargo's wise advice to be a good whip of the real dragon cow. Otherwise the Iron Throne would have declared war and plundered everywhere. Brother Willis, you are finally here. King's Landing has 3 royal mints. Minting coins is one of the few powers that the king has. Other nobles in the 7 kingdoms do not have such power. As the chief economic advisor to His Majesty the Emperor, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is in charge of a large number of government officials, including the revenue and expenditure of the royal family and the treasury, the payment of taxes and tariffs, and foreign loans, including these 3 local mints. There is a lot of money in the mints, and the 3 mint directors during Robert Baratheon's time are now also blowing cold wind on the Great Wall, and the newly replaced directors naturally dare not make any rash moves in a short period of time. Moreover, as a royal industry, this place is also guarded by the Unsullied Legion, the exclusive royal guard. In the past, corruption and chaos prevailed in the mints during King Robert's time, but the Unsullied Legion abandoned their desires, and it was even more difficult to convince them to participate in it. Therefore, the mints of the new dynasty are still relatively clean, and recently they have taken on a new task, which is to recycle a large number of old coins, and then recast them into new coins. Now they are very busy. At this moment, Willis Tyrrell solved the problem of old linen and set off to the Royal Mint in King's Landing. At this moment, the Minister of Finance Illyrio has been waiting for a long time. Lord Illyrio. Willis walked into the busy furnace room with a cane, and then saw the fat Pentus man with golden hair and a forked beard. He nodded politely and greeted him, but in return he laughed. "Come, brother. Come with me, I'll show you here." Although Illyrio later made a lot of money from the business of spices, gems, and dragon bones, and eventually became a wealthy merchant governor of Pentus, he was essentially a mercenary and thief, and later did a lot of shady business. When he met Viserys, he was very respectful, but in private he was also a generous person. However, no one knew how much dagger was hidden in his smile. If someone believed in Illyrio, he might be pitted badly. Although John Connington was living under someone else's roof, he didn't like or trust Illyrio that much. If the other party had not really played a crucial role in the start of His Majesty's career, John Connington would have wanted to take him down long ago. Although Willis was young, he was indeed well versed in the rules between nobles. Illyrio seemed to be close to him, but Willis was not confused. He still kept a proper distance, not too close nor too far away. Illyrio's family business was in Pentus. He was close to Willis, mainly because he wanted to use the relationship and connections of the Tyrrell family to benefit himself. After all, he was not in his hometown now. People like them did not have a reason to be close, nor did they have a reason to hate. Everything was in the most fundamental interests. "Brother, come and see. Do you know how this new coin is made?" The fat Pentus man walked into the workshop, surrounded by the clanging of hammers. The craftsman kept hammering in the hot and stuffy environment. Before there were machines such as roller presses and rocker presses, coins had to be hammered out one by one. At this moment, Illyrio held a brand new golden dragon in his hand, then turned around and chuckled twice, and continued to ask, "Do you know how much profit there is in making this golden dragon?" Willis thought for a moment, then shook his head, and told the truth. "I don't know. Please help me, my lord." Although he was well read, he had never led a soldier before Highgarden was surrounded by Dornishmen. Similarly, before Willis came to King's Landing, he didn't know the life of the lower class, including many seemingly basic common sense. He knew countless kinds of coins from ancient times to the present, including those of the trading city-states, and knew their origins and history, but he didn't know how they were made. Chapter 693 Potential Stock. Each gold coin is not made of pure gold, because gold is too soft and too delicate to be used normally. So when the mint casts gold coins, it will mix about 20% of other metals into it, which can increase the hardness and wear resistance of the gold coins. And these mixed metals include silver, brass, copper, etc. Surrounded by craftsmen working enthusiastically, Illyrio held the new coin in his palm, which was shining, and even had a little residual heat, and joked, "If the proportion of these mixed metals fluctuates a little bit, it will be an amazing wealth." The fat Pentus made a little bit gesture. Indeed, Viserys decided to recycle most of the gold coins on the market, and unify the currency circulation system of Westeros, so whether it is recasting or new forging, it is definitely a huge project. This little bit of difference was enough to make everyone in the mint rich, and Willis couldn't help but take a deep breath when he heard it. As a member of the Tyrrell family, he could imagine the huge profit margin. "Brother, do you know where the previous director of the mint went?" Then Illyrio threw the golden dragon in his hand upward and asked. The brown-haired young man with a cane nodded slightly. "I heard that he put on black clothes and went to the Great Wall to guard the border." "That's right." Illyrio chuckled and nodded. King Robert might not have dreamed that the Unsullied would later find 100,000 gold dragons from the director's cellar. In today's world, an ordinary family may not be able to earn a gold dragon in a year. 200 silver coins can hire a killer to kill their enemies, and 100 gold dragons can redeem captured nobles from bandits. And the director of a royal mint in King's Landing could actually find 100,000 gold royals in his home, which is definitely an extremely exaggerated number. Therefore, the quality of the newly minted coins during Robert Baratheon's time was very poor, and the people in the market were unwilling to accept them. But our King Robert doesn't care. He just wants the mint to work at full capacity to make money for him. The same is true of the former mediocre King Egan. The coins he minted can be called the worst in history, causing chaos in the economic system of the Seven Kingdoms. After his death, the Civil War broke out. If it is superficially the result of his having too many illegitimate children and legalizing them, in fact, the economic chaos and corruption is also the cause of the subsequent turmoil in the Seven Kingdoms. Although Illyrio was born a thief and mercenary, he is still very capable as a finance minister. After all, he started from scratch and became the wealthy governor of Pentus. Among his retainers and slaves, there are people who are proficient in knowledge and give him advice. Lord Illyrio is right. After listening to his boss's words, Willis was silent for a moment and then nodded slightly. He didn't know why Illyrio asked him to say this, but he continued to speak. So the work of the mint is very important. It must be controlled by a reliable person, and there must be no mistakes. That's right. Willis continued to speak along with Illyrio's words, and the fat Pentus man laughed and clapped his hands. "Brother, you are right. His Majesty also attaches great importance to this matter, and will personally inquire about it every now and then. However, the positions of the directors of the three mints are still vacant. I plan to hand this over to you. How about it? Do you have confidence?" After Illyrio's voice fell, Willis's face changed slightly. He didn't expect that the Minister of Finance would want him to take on the work of supervising the mint. However, the words here are like the dagger in the end, but in fact, Illyrio's move is not a dagger, but a big gift. After all, this is a lucrative job. It is difficult not to get rich if you take over this job. Illyrio wanted to sell the Tyrrells a favor in exchange for their friendship. But for Willis, it was a bit like a hot potato. His grandmother Rowena had the opposite idea from Willis. Willis wanted to be as low-key as possible and let people forget the former glory of the Tyrrells, but his grandmother had another idea. It was just that his boss said such a thing, and Willis seemed to be difficult to refuse. In the end, he was silent for a moment and nodded slightly. On the eaves of the mint courtyard, a black crow tilted its head slightly, and then flapped its wings and flew away. Willis is a potential stock. In Meager's tower in the Red Castle, Viserys opened his eyes again, and beside him floated a transparent soul that others could not see. But he is not mature enough at the moment. The immaturity that Viserys mentioned was actually not Willis' age. Willis was older than him, but he still had too little contact with the real world. After all, he was once the heir of Highgarden, but now he suddenly came to the grassroots to work and started to deal with trivial matters. Naturally, he felt a little uncomfortable. Let's see how effective he is. I plan to transfer him to Gulltown in the future to be independent. Gulltown, as one of the main port cities in Westeros, is indeed a place where people can make great achievements. And John Clinton's soul heard what Viserys said and nodded slightly in agreement. When he proposed Willis, he didn't really want to nominate him as the Prime Minister, and Willis was also John's third choice. Westerland Governor Mystoyne and Vale Governor Petty Baelish were both above him. John Clinton just felt that such a talented and potential young man should not be buried. He recommended Willis to Viserys, so that His Majesty the Emperor could see him. In fact, Tyrion the Devil is also a suitable candidate for the hand of the king. Viserys did not forget that the other party had the potential to be the prime minister, but his identity was really special for the new dynasty. Moreover, as the king's personal advisor, although Tyrion has no real power, he can enter and leave the royal council and give advice to Viserys at any time. In fact, the little devil's status is very transcendent, and it doesn't matter whether he is the prime minister or not. Your Majesty, how should the final candidate be decided? John Connington's soul floated in the air and asked. Viserys thought for a moment, and actually now he has roughly an answer, based on the trends in the court and the public. Send a message to Casterly Rock tomorrow, and ask Miss Toyne to come to King's Landing. Chapter 694, Governor eases counsel. The next morning, a raven flew to the west of the Empire through the hands of Grand Maester Marwyn. The former head of the Golden Company, the governor of the West, Miss Toyne, was about to take office as the fourth prime minister. On the other side, the Imperial fleet on the other side of the narrow sea left Tyrosh and arranged its formation to sail to their next stop, Lyse. But the news of the arrival of the Imperial fleet in Lyse caused a panic, because a rumor had spread throughout Lyse not long ago. The content of the rumor was that Asher Greyjoy, the messenger of the Iron Throne, had encountered a carefully planned assassination in Tyrosh. If the messenger of the Iron Throne had not been lucky enough, he might have died in Tyrosh. The mastermind of this assassination was the Governor Council of Lyse. Because Lyse and Tyrosh are now on the verge of war over the sovereignty of the disputed land, the Lyse people hope to assassinate the messenger of the Iron Throne, provoke the relationship between the Iron Throne and Tyrosh, and then get the support of the Empire and successfully monopolize the disputed land. However, the Lyse people were self-defeating. Not only did they fail to assassinate Asher Greyjoy, but they also let the Tyroshi people find out the truth. Now the Tyroshi Lord is mobilizing troops and actively preparing supplies. At the same time, he has signed treaties with several mercenary groups. The entire city-state has entered a state of war. Warships are densely packed in the port. It seems that they are about to attack Lyse. The war between the two sides is imminent. The Imperial fleet happened to visit Lyse at this critical juncture, which is hard not to let people imagine. After all, the fleet has 2,000 elite Imperial soldiers who have fought in the War of Conquest. If they suddenly attack, even the trading city-states will suffer heavy losses. Lyse is one of the 9 free trade cities. Its geographical location is on the southern coast of the Essos continent, southeast of Tyroshi and west of Volantis. It is a city built on rocks, surrounded by stormy seas. At the same time, the entire city-state spans several islands, consisting of a main city port and several prosperous satellite islands, which are also prosperous. However, at this moment in the Governor's Council of Lyse, 12 Lyse governors sat around a huge round conference table. Some of them were fat, some were thin, and their ages varied from young to old. Behind them stood their most loyal slaves. But without exception, they all had blue eyes, platinum curly hair, and fair skin. Even the elderly were well maintained, dressed delicately and appropriately, and looked very gentle and polite. Because the bloodline of the ancient Valyrian freehold was still very strong in them, the closer you got to that land, the more you could see the Valyrian race. I received intelligence from an informant that the Iron Throne's fleet was preparing to cooperate with the Tyrosh army to attack Lyse. At this time, a young Lyse governor with long light blonde hair spoke up. The Iron Throne should not easily get involved in the war between Tyrosh and us. Another Lyse governor who was a little older, with grey hair but still well maintained, said worriedly. But what if they have the so-called evidence? Lord Hader, the young governor retorted without hesitation. We know very well that we did not do so, but the people of Tyroshi do not think so. They persuaded the messenger of the Iron Throne to launch an attack on Lyse. We must protect ourselves. Everyone. The young Lyse governor stood up, and all the Lyse governors present looked at each other. Then all looked up at each other, and one of them could not help but ask, Lord Humphrey Hightower, do you have any solution? Humphrey Hightower was the heir of the Hightower family in Old Town, the fourth and youngest son of Earl Leighton Hightower. He had fled to Lyse by boat before the Dawn army broke through Old Town last year, so he survived. His 3 brothers all died on the battlefield, and Humphrey Hightower became the only heir of the Hightower family. The young heir of the Hightower family fled to Lyse, but he did not come empty-handed. He packed as much as he could and brought a lot of wealth from the Hightower family. With this huge amount of wealth, Humphrey quickly established himself in lies. With the help of people inside and outside, he acquired several industries in one fell swoop and eventually became one of the youngest trade governors in lies, qualified to enter the Governor's Council of Lies. Humphrey has established himself in lies, but after all, he is a newcomer, so his voice in the Governor's Council is not very deep. Where there are people, there are rivers and lakes, not to mention that in a place like the Governor's Council, not every governor has equal voice, but also depends on the power behind them. But Humphrey was not discouraged, but hid himself, and kept a low profile until now he stood up, and became the focus of everyone present. Of course, Lord Callum. Humphrey heard another governor ask, and answered without hesitation. Obviously he had already prepared a plan. The Hightower family and the Targaryen family have a deep entanglement, and the two sides have married several times in history, so this Governor Humphrey has some shadows of Valyrians in his appearance. He was handsome, with fair skin, blue eyes, and long light blonde hair. He looked like a native of Lies. After more than a year, he had learned to speak Valyrian, so there was no communication barrier. I have contacted Saladin. This pirate governor expressed his willingness to form an alliance with Lies to fight against the enemies from Tirosh. He only seeks Lies' support. Saladin was the pirate who had suddenly launched a coup attack in me not long ago, killing 2 other governors supported by Tirosh and Volantis, and dominated me. He had a powerful fleet that crisscrossed the Narrow Sea and a large number of sailors familiar with naval warfare. Therefore, this pirate governor was willing to help Lies, and would definitely be a strong ally. However, when Humphrey Hightower's words fell, the Governor's Council in Lies exploded. What? It was this traitor. The old governor who spoke first was full of anger on his face. No, absolutely not. If he can betray Lies once, he can betray us a second time. Right. This cannot be tolerated. The other Lies governors also echoed this, but only Humphrey Hightower and the fat governor sitting opposite him remained calm. They exchanged a subtle look and then separated. But it was obvious that they had expected such a reaction before. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 695 Humphrey Hightower. Me, which was rebuilt after the destruction, has 3 governors. Saladin is the governor of Me, supported by the Lies. It stands to reason that the Lies should be happy that the governor supported by the Lies killed the others. But in fact, it is not the case. The Lies Governor Council has never regarded Saladin as a governor, but only as a pawn, a running dog, and a tool to extract benefits for Lies. The Lies Council has never thought of taking over Me, because it is obviously an act of greed, and Lies does not have the strength to swallow Me alone. And this behavior is likely to lead to a war. Tirosh and Volantis are also coveting this piece of fat like a hungry wolf. However, Saladin, the running dog supported by the Lies, did not listen to the orders of the Governor Council. Instead, he took the initiative to launch an attack without authorization, successfully killed the other 2 governors, and took control of Me. The self-proclaimed Prince of the Narrow Sea pirate governor's capture of Me meant that he had lost control of Lies and became the real king of Me. The Lies Governor Council was furious when they heard the news and wanted to send troops to punish this disobedient lackey, but at this time the Lies people realized that the cloud of war had been looming over their heads. Because of the coup in Me, no matter how the Lies Governor Council explained it to the outside world, in Volantis and Tirosh's view, Saladin was the governor supported by Lies, and this was how Lies successfully captured Me. Therefore, coupled with the assassination, the Tiroshi prince determined that the mastermind behind the scenes was the Lies people who were proficient in poison, and he vowed to make the Lies people pay the price. He assembled the army as quickly as possible, signed several mercenary groups active in these areas, and prepared to launch a war to seize the disputed lands. Now the cloud of a war has shrouded the disputed lands, and the Lies people have no way to defend themselves. Instead, they dare not send troops to quell the rebellion, fearing that they will be attacked by Tiroshi. Therefore, Saladasan really did a great disservice to the Lies people, and it was reasonable for these people to hate him. But now the new governor Humphrey Hightower suddenly proposed to join forces with the traitor Saladasan. How could it not cause an uproar? However, when the governor's council hall in Lies was noisy, Humphrey Hightower, who was standing in his seat, and the wealthy governor sitting opposite him exchanged glances implicitly, and the governor sitting opposite immediately understood. Then, the wealthy governor Trigomoran, who had a greasy face and a fat body that was a bit crowded in the chair, stood up with his hand on the conference round table. I support Lord Hightower's proposal. As soon as he spoke, the chaotic and noisy situation at the scene quickly quieted down, and all the governors of Lies looked at him. Because Trigomoran is different from Humphrey Hightower who just arrived. His family has been operating in Lies for many years. Under Trig's leadership, the O'Mollen family has soared to the sky and now sits on the throne of governor. When Humphrey first came to Lies, it was actually Trig O'Mollen who gave him advice and secretly helped him gain a foothold in Lies. However, it is interesting that few people outside know the relationship between the two. They don't have much contact in public, and they look like two unfamiliar people. But in fact, Trig O'Mollen's favorite concubine is Humphrey Hightower's sister Linnes Hightower. Linnes Hightower is the youngest daughter of Earl Eaton Hightower, and also the most beautiful daughter. She has long golden hair, high breasts, milky white skin, and soft hands. She once fascinated Joram Ormond, Earl of Bear Island, and he did not hesitate to spend all his family property to satisfy her material desires, and even started the slave trade. However, when the matter was exposed, and Joram Ormond was penniless, and could no longer satisfy her, she left him, and sailed to Lies, and finally married Trig O'Moran, a wealthy governor of Lies. Therefore, Trig O'Moran was Humphrey's brother-in-law. With this relationship, the relationship between the two was naturally very close and private. But at this moment, Trig's voice of support for Humphrey caused the governors of Lies present to be puzzled, because in their opinion, the two people did not have much intersection on weekdays. Trig O'Moran stood in his seat, and looked around at the governors of Lies around him calmly, and then spoke loudly. My lord governors, Saladasan betrayed Lies, and must be punished. But not now. The other governors of Lies couldn't help whispering, when they heard his words. But he, the wealthy governor, did not care about the discussions of others, but continued to speak loudly. Now we are facing the Taroshi army and the misunderstanding of the Iron Throne's messenger. No matter what, we need the help of our allies now. Saladasan killed the envoys of Taroshi and Volantis, and he will never join the enemy camp, so he can only ask us for help. We can use Saladasan's fleet to overcome the current difficulties, repel the Taroshi army, and then turn around to deal with him. Trig O'Moran's words made sense. No matter what, Lies is now attacked from all sides, and must get support from allies. And Saladasan has done those things, and it is impossible for him to surrender to the Taroshi or Volantis. Therefore, he can only seek help from Lies, and Lies now happens to need the other party's fleet to fight. As for the betrayal in the past, it can be settled after the war is over. Lord Trig O'Moran's words make sense. I agree. Lies governor raised his hand in agreement. Yes, I agree. Agree. Except for Humphrey Hightower and Trig O'Moran, the other 10 governors of the 12 governors in the governor's council seemed to be convinced and nodded in agreement. After all, the immediate interests are the most important. If you can't get through this hurdle, the rest of the future is nonsense. But there is still a problem, Lord Humphrey Hightower. At this time, another governor of Lies raised a question. It is said that the fleet of the Iron Throne's envoy is about to arrive in Lies. What should we do? Although the young Governor Hightower was born in Westeros, no one believed that he would collude with the Iron Throne. After all, the Hightower family was destroyed, and the tragedy at that time was still vivid in people's minds. Chapter 696 Blockage. On the ship of the Empire, the uncle and nephew who had reunited after a long separation were arguing about something. Asher, your father's greatest dream in life was to make the Iron Kingdom independent and restore the ancient roads. Now you have soldiers and ships, why don't you sail directly to the end of the world and conquer an island to be the king? Victorian didn't understand why his niece was so afraid of Viserys. The character flowing in the blood of the Iron race is unyielding. No matter how powerful the dragon is, it is impossible to fly to the end of the world to hunt Asher. He had been to Myrene and knew that this world was much bigger than he imagined. There was an even more vast world on the other side of the Skeleton Mountains. The world is big, and freedom is the greatest. Wouldn't it be much better to be the king at the end of the world, build an empire, and live happily and freely than to be a dog for that guy from the Targaryen family? However, on the other side of the argument, Asher also didn't understand why her father and uncle were always obsessed with restoring the ancient roads. And they also wanted to seek the independence of the Iron Islands. The Ironborn demanded the restoration of the ancient roads, and paid iron money, to buy goods and concubines, but in the end, aren't they just a bunch of robbers? As for seeking independence, the Iron Islands are short of resources, and can't even grow any food, because of the land. There are only some worthless iron ores. If the Iron Islands are independent from Westeros, they can't even support themselves, not to mention that the Iron Islands are now sparsely populated, and even turned into a den of ghosts. Now she heard that her second uncle Euron Greyjoy has cleared the remaining whites on the island, but the population of immigrants to the island is still scarce. Even refugees who fled famine are unwilling to go to the Iron Islands. Euron can only rely on plundering some islands of indigenous people and capturing some captives to make up the number. Do the Iron Islands still want independence like this? The Iron Islands now have less than 1,800 people at most, and they can still be counted as a domain. Giving the position of governor of a territory is already a face giving. If it weren't for historical factors, the Iron Islands would even be absorbed into the system of the Westerly. Now, after hearing what her uncle said, Asher suppressed her anger and spoke. Uncle, the Iron Islands are no longer in my hands. If you want the Iron Islands to be independent, you might as well go to Euron, not me. If it weren't for the fact that Victarion did save her life, Asher's words might have been even more unpleasant. And do you think these soldiers, except for the Iron Race, that escaped with me, will listen to my orders? It was fine for Asher to give other orders, such as attacking cities, robbing merchant ships, etc., but it was absolutely impossible to order them to abandon the Iron Throne. After all, they were not the army of the Greyjoy family. Today's soldiers have a concept of home and country. They are not like the nobles who were once loyal to their heads, and even followed the rebellion without hesitation. Today's soldiers are only loyal to the royal family and the entire country. Therefore, it is impossible for Asher to lead them to dominate the end of the world. Euron? Asher, you know, how could I possibly go find this guy? Victarion and Euron had always had a bad relationship. In fact, the Greyjoy brothers didn't get along well with the second brother Euron, even though Euron and his sister-in-law hadn't committed adultery yet. The tall middle-aged man frowned and said, I don't mean anything else, just a suggestion. If you don't want to listen, forget it. In fact, he really wanted to seize the command of the fleet. Victarion had always regarded himself as the right-hand man of his elder brother Balon, and should inherit the Seaston throne after his death, and his niece was just a woman. He didn't want to murder Asher, but Victarion felt that commanding the fleet to fight should be left to men. However, when Victarion arrived at the fleet, he found that except for some Ironborn who listened to his command for face, he couldn't command anyone else. An Imperial Navy captain from the Vale even looked him up and down with strange eyes, which made Victarion feel a little uncomfortable, but he couldn't get angry. He didn't know what happened here after traveling half a circle in Myrene. Why did the world he knew change a little bit? However, at this moment, a wailing horn suddenly sounded on the sea. Victarion and Asher looked at each other quickly and immediately opened the door of the cabin and ran out. What's going on? Commander-in-Chief. A commander with golden hair wearing Imperial Navy armor and holding a helmet in his arms was standing at the bow. He saw Asher Greyjoy running over and quickly stood up and saluted, then raised his hand and pointed to the distance and said, a fleet flying the flag of lies blocked our way. What? When Asher heard the words of her subordinates, her brows slightly frowned, and then she raised her head and looked into the distance. A white mist rose from the sea in the distance. Although it was not very clear, it was possible to vaguely see that there were densely packed warships arranged in formation, blocking the front of the Imperial fleet. Telescope. Then she reached out and took the Mirish monocular from the officer's hand, put it on her right eye, squinted her left eye, and looked into the distance. With the help of the telescope, Asha could easily see the flag of the fleet blocking the front. It is really the flag of lies. Asha frowned and put down the telescope in her hand and returned it to her subordinates. What do the lies people want to do? Did they really do it? The Imperial Fleet's itinerary for this visit had been notified to various trading cities in advance. It started from me and then arrived at Tarosh, Lies, and finally arrived at Volantis. Then it bypassed the still rioting sea of smoke and went to the island of Nath. However, Lies did not object at that time and even welcomed the visit of the Imperial Fleet. But after the assassination, it refused the entry of the fleet. Why? It was hard not for Asha to feel that the cover-up was only making things more obvious and the whole thing was becoming more and more confusing. Hundreds of miles away in me, a distinguished guest wearing a hood came here secretly under the protection of many spies. The merchant ship from King's Landing seemed calm, but in fact, countless eyes were scanning everything around, including the drunken mercenaries sitting on the bow, the plump wealthy merchants, the women with headscarves holding children, etc. In the crowded port of Me, the man got off the ship and took off his hood, revealing a pale and gloomy face. Then he took a deep breath of fresh air and smiled brightly. Chapter 697 Muddy Waters. His Majesty did not say that we must conquer these trading cities now, because His Majesty's eyes are now on the north, and he has no time to care about these trivial matters, so he handed the matter over to me. He told me, the enemies in the north are getting closer and closer. I have already felt that this time they will be more fierce than before. They breathe cold air, and cold fires are burning. At this moment, the newly appointed Earl of Erenal in the Empire was in a tavern room in Me. He was holding a wine jug and pouring wine, and then he spoke in the tone that Viserys used to speak. But there was a little more grim in his tone, which made the great pirate Saladin's son, who was also sitting in the room, a little uneasy. Lord Ramsay Bolton, I don't think the White Walkers will appear on the continent of Essos. He had never seen a White Walker, but he had seen the Whites with his own eyes a few years ago. It was during a public exhibition in Pentus that the Dothraki used a lasso to capture several Whites alive and then put them in cages. Finally, they were escorted to Pentus by Euron's Iron Fleet. Only then did the people of Pentus know what kind of monsters their king was fighting against, and they won and successfully drove these monsters back to their hometown. Later, these Whites on display all died, perhaps because the magic in their bodies dissipated, or for some other reason, which made the municipal officials of Pentus very disappointed. Because the exhibition of Whites caused a huge sensation in the world of the trading city-states, people from all over the world came to Pentus from afar, trying to see what the legendary Whites looked like. At that time, Pentus could make a lot of money just by collecting tickets. This also led to a large number of explorers, slave hunting teams, mercenary groups, etc. from the continent of Essos forming teams and sailing to the north to capture more Whites for profit. But unfortunately, few succeeded. They underestimated the Whites in cages, thinking they were prey to be slaughtered at will, but when they arrived in the north, they paid a very tragic price. Most of their slave hunting teams died in the north and became part of the army of Whites. The few teams that successfully captured Whites died in the cabin on their way back by boat, turning into a pool of rotten meat or scattered bones. It seems that the Whites lost their magic after leaving Westeros. The Iron Fleet was able to successfully capture the Whites because the Night King had not retreated at that time, and the power of the God of Cold remained at its maximum. However, Ramsay only smiled slightly when he heard the words of the pirate governor, put down the wine jug in his hand, and then spoke. That's not necessarily true, Lord Saladin. The Iron Islands were also conquered by the White Walkers. Seeing the slightly uncomfortable expression on the face of the dark-skinned pirate governor, Ramsay restrained the smile on his face and spoke seriously. Has Lord Thorne found any clues about the assassination? The assassination of Asha Greyjoy, the envoy of the Empire, also spread, causing quite a stir. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that this might not be aimed at the Empire, but for other purposes, because Asha, the envoy of the Empire, was not actually a very important figure, but a marginal figure on the Iron Throne. Even if she died, it would have no impact on the Empire. However, what confused the pirate governor was how something that happened in less than half a month could have reached the ears of the emperor so quickly. Could it be that, although suspicions arose in his heart, he still shook his head and said honestly, nothing was found. These assassins wanted to frame Volantis lies. Lies was rich in poisons, and Volantis was mentioned in the confession. Of course, it was not ruled out that someone was trying to cover up the truth. The Lord of Tirosh also did not escape suspicion. The Empire's fleet sent troops to the island of Nas and sent envoys to various free trade cities along the way. However, Asha Greyjoy did nothing, but she stirred up a great earthquake in the world of trade cities. Saladasan did not believe that there was no pusher behind this. The young man with a gloomy face in front of him, the dark-skinned pirate governor, quietly looked at the other party while speaking. In fact, Ramsay Bolton was not well known, but he had heard of his name a long time ago. Every profession has a circle, and intelligence is still very important in the pirate circle. Ramsay Bolton had heard of this name as early as when he was in Pentus. The reason was that the other party was ruthless and ruthless. No pirate who fell into the hands of the other party came out alive. This was also true for smugglers. He heard that a smuggler was interrogated by a black-robed spy after being caught in Pentus. He tried to explain to the other party that the smuggler was not a pirate and was not guilty of death, but the smuggler was taken away and eventually never returned. However, even though he had some doubts in his heart, he did not dare to ask them in front of him. God knows whether the chaos in the world of the free trade cities was caused by them. So, what should we do next? Lord Ramsay, what instructions does your majesty have? And Saladasan did not dare to think too much, but asked directly. Now he has contacted the governor of Lies, Trigomorlan, and Humphrey of the Hightower family, and the two sides are plotting to seize Lies. The other party also expressed their willingness to surrender to the Iron Throne, and the corresponding condition is that the Hightower family can be forgiven by His Majesty the Emperor and return to Westeros and their hometown. Of course, Old Town will definitely not be taken back. Now Old Town no longer belongs to the Hightower family, and no family has been canonized. It is now managed by the city officials appointed by the Emperor. On the other hand, the conditions of the O'Malley family are to dominate Lies alone. He is no longer satisfied with sharing this rich city-state with the other 11 governors, but wants to become the Prince of Lies like Saladasan, the pirate governor of Mia, and hold power alone. Chaos is a ladder to climb up. Ramsay Bolton, the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Ministry of Internal Affairs, sneered and said, "This sentence was said by someone I don't like very much, but I think it makes sense. Today, the rise of the Empire is accompanied by turmoil and chaos in the whole world. People are struggling to survive, and the upper class uses this as a ladder for promotion. Saladasan is such a person, and so is Governor Trigomorlan of Lies. Humphrey Hightower is a little inferior to them, and has become a pawn. Continue to contact them, and muddy the waters of the trading city-states." Chapter 2 Wait a minute, I've been too busy with work recently. Chapter 698, Clouds of Civil War. Lies' navy stopped the Empire's fleet from continuing to head south, to visit Lies near the Stepstones, citing the impending war. As a result, the fleet was forced to temporarily stop at the disputed lands to seek supplies. This land was once a prosperous place under the rule of the Valyrian Freehold, but in the 4 centuries after the fall of the Freehold, wars broke out frequently here, destroying this prosperity, but it still has great potential. Asha Greyjoy's fleet temporarily stopped at the disputed lands, and a war broke out as expected at the place where the two seas meet. Lord Taroshi hired many large and small mercenary groups. He accused the Lies people of intending to poison the messenger of the Iron Throne, and put the blame on Taroshi. The most important thing was that Lord Taroshi believed that Lies had seized Mia, which was the main reason for the outbreak of this war. The balance of the 3 sisters' kingdoms had long been broken, and the price of the balance being broken was the shadow of war, and all parties would inevitably fight and bleed. The Lies people had seized Mia, and for the Taroshi people, it was a life and death moment, so they had to strike first. Even the Taroshis did not hesitate to invite Volantis and the Empire to participate in this war over the sovereignty of Mir and the disputed land. However, the ruling party of Volantis is now the moderate Elephant Party, which has an ambiguous attitude, and did not agree to the request of the Toroshi Lord, and seems to want to continue to see the situation. On the other hand, the invitation to the Empire's navy to intervene was directly rejected. Asha Greyjoy would not let her fleet participate in this local war jointly detonated by several trading city-states. The Toroshi side was aggressive, and Lies was naturally not to be outdone. Lies' governor's council denied all accusations against Toroshi, including planning assassinations, framing, and seizing the. But then on the me side, the great pirate Saladasan, who was still the governor of Miraname, but had actually become the Prince of Me, also spoke out in support of his hometown. At the same time, he was actively preparing for war, and hired his old friend Bloodbird and his 3,000 warriors to prepare for a decisive battle with the Tereshis. This is a life and death war between the two sides. If the Tereshis win, they can unify the former kingdom of the Three Daughters, including the vast disputed lands, and become a real kingdom of Toroshi. The victory of the Lysians is probably the same. Lies the next Toroshi, and Mie, which had just been rebuilt from destruction, was still not qualified to resist the attack of the Lysians. At best, they were just dependent on the thighs of Tereshis and Lysians. However, the war in the kingdom of the Three Daughters was shrouded in the dark clouds. Both sides were actively preparing for war. The war was almost imminent, but the Empire's fleet would not stay here forever and wait for the war to end before leaving. Otherwise, the war would last for a year or so. Could they wait here for so long? After entering the Summer Sea, the Imperial fleet stopped at the disputed lands to seek supplies. A few days later, the fleet continued to move southeast along the coast of the Essos continent, heading for their next destination, Volantis. Volantis is located in the southeast corner of the Free Trade City, in the east of the disputed lands, at the mouth of the Rhine River. It is the closest free trade city to Valyria, with a long history and is powerful. At the same time, Volantis is also the absolute overlord of the surrounding area. The three trading cities of Lies, Tirosh and Me once had to join hands to fight against Volantis. However, the Imperial fleet is now heading here, which makes Volantis a little trembling. Because the Imperial fleet's visit is like a disaster. Wherever they go, accidents or wars break out. Asha Greyjoy's fleet visited the kingdom of the Three Daughters, but only 2 of the 3 visited, and the remaining one, Lies, was not visited in time. Now the Three Daughters are about to kill each other and become a mess. Volantis is also a little worried that the arrival of the Imperial fleet will bring this bad luck with it. However, based on Volantis' pride and confidence as the eldest daughter of Valyria, Queen of the Rhine and Mistress of the Summer Sea, Volantis did not refuse the entry of the Imperial fleet like Lies did. Instead, they prepared some diplomatic activities this time, but because of historical reasons, the Volantines generally hostile to the Targaryen family. After all, 2 of the 3 ruling giants in Volantis are from the Elephant Party, and the ruling philosophy of the Elephant Party is to conquer the world through trade, so communication and cooperation are naturally indispensable. The 2 Elephant Party governors are Dofus Panemian and Narciso Wisama, and the only Tiger Party governor is Malacha Miji, who has met Viserys once. During the last riot in the Sea of Smoke, Malacha Miji organized a fleet of 20 ships to explore the ruins of Valyria. His nephew was the commander-in-chief, and Viserys disguised himself and mixed in. Their expedition team went as far as Valyria, the capital of the Freehold. Eventually, a riot broke out in the ruins, and demonized monsters were rampant. No one escaped except Viserys, the female mercenary Maya and Dr. Marwyn. Time passed quickly, and the Stepstones were shrouded in the dark clouds of war, while the fleet of the Empire on the sea was about to reach Volantis. On the other side, the distant unknown areas on the continent of Westeros were areas that humans had never set foot in, because the cold and the terrible white enemies were everywhere. Benjen Stark rode a skeleton horse, and followed the White Walkers in front of him. He didn't know how far he had walked, and how long he had walked. The sky above their heads gradually darkened. At the beginning, Benjen didn't notice it, but as he went deeper and deeper, even the cold-resistant trees and all life had disappeared. The surroundings were full of desolation, with only the howling of the biting cold wind. Only then did Benjen notice the obvious change in day and night time. The daytime seemed to be getting shorter and shorter, and the night was getting longer and longer. Sometimes the daytime only lasted a few hours, while the long night often lasted several days. However, the long night was not lonely, because the skeleton horse never knew how to get tired, and so did Benjen himself. Sometimes he could not help but be intoxicated by the gorgeous and psychedelic light in the northern sky while riding on horseback. However, after an unknown amount of time, the White Walker in front of him finally stopped. Chapter 699, Ice Altar. The White Walker in front pulled the reins and stopped, and Benjen suddenly woke up and hurriedly pulled the skeleton horse under his crotch. Although the other party had been ignoring him, which made him much bolder, the two sides still kept a certain distance, and Benjen did not dare to get close to the other party, even if he was brave. What if this White Walker suddenly got upset and wanted to strangle him to death? Benjen couldn't help but touch the dragon crystal dagger hidden in his arms. This weapon that could kill the White Walker became his last resort. Only every time he touched it, Benjen could make his mind clear again. However, now, Benjen pulled the skeleton horse under his crotch and raised his head to look forward. Then his pupils shrank slightly. His heart stopped beating, but fear came from the depths of his soul. Because in front of him was a huge ice altar, which opened like the claws of a dragon, protruding 5 cold and curved pillars, carved with complicated runes, emitting an ice blue light. Benjen only took a glance and felt his mind slightly dazed for a second. Then he quickly shook his head to dispel the daze in his mind. He didn't know where he was now, why there was such a giant ice altar of supernatural craftsmanship on this land that humans had never set foot on. Who built it? Could it be a White Walker? What is its function? However, these were not the fundamental reasons why Benjen was so terrified. The fundamental reason was on the other side of this ice altar, right in front of Benjen and the White Walker. He had been distracted for too long by the gorgeous aurora above his head. It was only then that he realized that the violent snowstorm had stopped at some point, and even the whistling wind in his ears had disappeared. There was no snow under his feet. The gorgeous aurora in the sky was clear, as if it was right in front of him. Fascinating. In the distance, the dense army of the dead was also particularly clear. They were arranged in an orderly manner, as if someone had given them an order. There was no end in sight, and the leaders were the White Walkers riding mounts. Some of them rode mammoths, some rode ice spiders, some rode dire wolves, and some rode skeleton horses like Benjen and the White Walker in front of him. The huge ice spider was 4 or 5 meters long, with long and beautiful legs stepping on the ice. Its small ice blue eyes were shining, and there were traces of blood on the edge of its huge and ferocious mouth. Half of the mammoth's cheek had also rotted, exposing bones and rotten flesh. These endless armies of the dead and hundreds of White Walkers stood neatly in front of the altar, as if they were waiting for something. But at this moment, all of them raised their heads and looked at the two people coming from afar, without making any sound. So many people were silent, as if a pin drop could be heard. No wonder Benjen was a little distracted by the beautiful aurora in the sky, and didn't notice anything the whole time. Benjen's heart was no longer beating, but the fear that surged from the depths of his soul still made him tremble. After all, his soul was still a human being. Benjen's body was now in a state of uncertainty. He didn't know whether he was a White or a White Walker, but his soul was still out of control. He was now alone in the 7 layers of hell, facing the gazes of countless ghosts. If they find something strange about themselves, maybe they will tear themselves to pieces without hesitation. Benjen couldn't help thinking so. His fingers trembled slightly, and he held the reins of the skeleton horse tightly. He even hesitated for a second, whether to turn around and run away. However, at this moment, the White Walker walking in front of him finally made a move. The chain and reins of the other party turned over and dismounted, making a sound. Its feet stepped on the cold, smooth and even transparent ice surface, and then, like countless dead people and White Walkers on the opposite side, it turned its head and looked at Benjen. It was unknown how long it had been, half a month or 2 months. He didn't know, but this was the second time the other party looked at him since then. Damn it. Benjen felt fear enveloping his whole body again, and he almost wanted to turn his horse's head and run away. Even though he had become a dead man, he didn't want to be torn to pieces by these monsters. Fortunately, the other party just glanced at him without any movement, then turned his head and looked at the altar, then left its mount where it was and walked towards the altar. The footsteps of the White Walker made a sound. Benjen felt like sitting on pins and needles sitting on the skeleton horse. He held the reins of the mount under his crotch tightly, not knowing what he should do at this moment. Now that the main force is on the opposite side, should he take the opportunity to slip over, like a late recruit at the military roll call, quietly standing at the back, trying to get away with it, or just standing there and becoming the focus of everyone's attention? Or Benjen looked at the White Walker walking towards the altar again, or pretended to follow behind him and enter the altar? No matter what the other party wants to do, after entering the altar, it is definitely not good for humans. If he can take the opportunity to destroy and stop the other party's plan, generally speaking, he will die without regrets. However, the sense of responsibility has not yet overcome the fear in his heart. When Benjen was entangled, the White Walker who was slowly walking towards the altar had entered the range of the altar. Then he untied a package around his waist and put a round thing in it, which seemed to be a stone. Because the distance was too far, Benjen followed the other party for so long, but just found that the other party was carrying something on his body. What is this? Benjen was slightly stunned, but the White Walker had already placed the black stone in his hand on the altar made of ice. The next second, the ice blue flame that shot up into the sky began to burn fiercely. Crash! The white-haired White Walker standing in the altar knelt on one knee, and all the White Walkers in the distance and the endless whites also knelt on the ground, as if they were worshipping the ice blue flame. What is this? Benjen looked at the ice blue flame and his mind went blank. His fingers trembled slightly. He instinctively guessed that, if he had just stopped the other party, it might still be in time, but now, all the dead knelt under the ice blue flame burning in the altar. This jumping blue flame seemed to have some kind of magic that made people unconsciously intoxicated. Benjen's eyes gradually dulled, and then he also jumped off the horse's back and crawled to the ground with his butt sticking out. Chapter 700 Legendary Stories. Benjen fell to his knees, and then he blended into the army of the dead and became one of them. There were all kinds of dead ghosts around him. However, his loyal mount still followed him and did not leave. After an unknown amount of time, the army of the dead began to slowly retreat, heading towards the farther north, and the ice blue flame was still burning, as if it would never go out. They climbed over a towering mountain and continued to move towards the boundless north, away from the range of the ice blue flame, until it completely disappeared from everyone's sight, and Benjen woke up. What's wrong with me? Benjen suddenly woke up, and then he felt cold from the soul. He had been deeply immersed in the ice blue flame when he saw it for the first time, and he had no idea what happened afterwards. He was like a puppet, obeying the orders of an unknown existence like his companions around him, and acting against his instincts, until he woke up again. He was already in the middle of the vast army of dead people, becoming one of them. His left hand was still holding his mount, red and yellow. Even though this old horse that had accompanied him for many years was dead, it seemed to have the same memory of its life as Banan. It had always been by his master's side and never left, even when he became confused. Thank you for your hard work, old friend. Banan stroked the mane of the skeleton horse, and the gentle old horse turned around and looked at him calmly, but now red and yellow looked a little hideous and scary. Half of its cheek had rotted, and the bones were also exposed. The entire army of dead people was moving forward in silence, without making any sound except for the sound of footsteps. They crossed the towering mountain and continued to move towards the unknown north. Banayan didn't know where they were going, but based on past experience, he looked up at night and saw the eyes of the ice dragon star and judged that they were still moving towards the north. I don't know if it was Benjen's illusion, but he felt that the ice dragon star seemed to be getting closer and closer to them, and the moon above his head also turned dark red, and it was more than 3 times larger than what he saw in the human world. The days are getting shorter and shorter, and the nights are getting longer and longer. Are we going to the moon? Benjen couldn't help thinking this as he looked at the ice dragon star and the moon above his head, which seemed to have grown a lot bigger. Even with people's imagination in this era, it is impossible to imagine where the north of Westeros leads to. Could it lead to the sky? Is Westeros actually the same size as Essos? It's just that the skeleton mountains that block the continent in Westeros are actually endless ice fields. And Westeros is just the vertical Essos continent. As the youngest son of Rickard, the former Duke of Winterfell, Benjen naturally received a good education since childhood. He knew that the world was very big, and it was definitely not just the size they knew. However, at this time, he alone set foot in a field that humans had never set foot on, and couldn't help letting go of himself, and began to imagine boldly. Benjen is now even looking forward to seeing something amazing next. He even thought of the stories about the Ice Dragon Star that the old nanny in Winterfell had told him. The size of the Ice Dragon is much larger than the dragons of the Targaryen family. They roam behind the endless ice fields and occasionally appear on the shivering sea. Their bodies are made of ice and snow, their eyes are pale blue crystals, they wave their huge translucent wings, and they breathe out cold air that is enough to freeze a ship into ice. There is a legendary place on the vast shivering sea, called the Cannibal Bay. According to legend, the ships that enter the Cannibal Bay and never return are all encountered by cruising ice dragons. They freeze the ships with a cold breath, and then eat all the humans on them. When Benjen was a child, he would feel cold all over every time he heard these stories told by the old nanny. However, when he grew up, he realized that the stories told by the old nanny were folktales, that he didn't know where he heard them from, and most of them were lies, deceiving children not to cry. Will we see the ice dragon that old nan mentioned if we keep going north? This thought flashed through Benjen's mind, and then he couldn't help shaking his head, no longer thinking about these bizarre things. He didn't think there would be a dragon bigger than Balerion on the endless ice field. He had witnessed the Black Death with his own eyes when he was in King's Landing. The huge body that covered the sky and the sun exuded a scorching heat. Just 100 meters away from it, he could feel the heat coming towards him. This feeling made him tremble. Benjen didn't think there was anything in the world that could beat a dragon. If there was, it was not a field that humans could get involved in. It must be the gods who could do it, and perhaps that was why the gods punished Valyria. Therefore, Benjen persuaded his brother to surrender as soon as possible, for the sake of his sister-in-law and children, not to resist fearlessly. It was an inevitable trend for Targaryen to conquer the Seven Kingdoms, and they had to pay for their past mistakes. Benjen pulled the red and yellow reins of his mount and followed the slow advance of the large army, his mind full of random thoughts. He couldn't do anything else now, and could only think wildly. He also wanted to find his sister Lyanna Stark, which was the purpose of his trip. Now there were so many whites and white walkers gathered here. Benjen guessed that Lyanna should be among these white walkers, but now he had no way to find his sister. Because he was surrounded by an endless army of whites, it was difficult to squeeze out, no matter which side he went, because these whites would not give way to him. And it was easy to see the clues. Although these white walkers and whites didn't seem to see anything, and also turned a blind eye to some of his abnormal behaviors, Benjen still felt that he shouldn't be too unique. Otherwise, it would really be like lighting a lantern to go to the toilet and looking for shit. However, Benjen thought wildly and followed the team tirelessly for a long time. How many changes of day and night have taken place in the human world, but here is eternal night. But at this moment, the pace of the zombie army suddenly stopped, and Benjen, who was a little confused and absent-minded, was slightly startled. If you don't have a very strong psychological quality in such an environment, anyone will go crazy in the end. However, a loud dragon roar suddenly sounded above his head, and this roar shook the endless ice field with monstrous anger. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.